His fist struck the door for the third time, and the plaster above the doorframe crumbled away in a thin stream. Mark Heller stood in the middle of his rented apartment, staring at the door as if it could withstand a siege. It couldn't. The lock was old, the hinges were rusty. Behind the door stood a man named Zeitz, accompanied by two others. Zeitz spoke calmly, which only made things worse. He said the guarantee agreement had been signed with Mark's digital signature. He said Lucas had disappeared, and now the debt fell on the guarantor. He named the amount, $4,600 plus interest as of today. Tomorrow the amount would be even higher. Mark opened the door because he had no choice but to. Zeitz entered first, a short man in a gray coat with the face of an accountant and the eyes of a longshoreman. The other two remained in the doorway. Zeitz walked around the room and surveyed it like an appraiser. A worn-out sofa, a table with a 6-year-old laptop, a shelf with logistics textbooks. He said the property here was worth 300 coins on market day. He said he didn't need the belongings, but the money. Mark replied that Lucas had taken out a loan without his knowledge, that the signature was forged, that he would file a claim. Zeitz listened and nodded as if he'd heard it 1,000 times. He explained that the complaint would take months to process while interest was accruing daily. He explained that the firm operated within the law, but that the law had its gray areas. He walked over to the window and looked out into the courtyard where a linden tree was in bloom and children were shouting. Then he set a deadline, 3 days. In 3 days, either the full amount would be paid or the trouble would begin. He didn't specify what kind. People in his line of work never specify. At that moment, Mark felt a draft, a cold one. Not a summery breeze from a window, but real winter cold that licked at his ankles. He instinctively glanced toward the storage room. The old storage room door had been covered with wallpaper even before he moved in. The landlady had said there was a solid wall back there and junk left behind by the previous tenants. Now, white frost was creeping up the wallpaper from the floor. Thin, icy tendrils were growing right on the paper like mold in Fast Forward. Mark blinked. Zeitz didn't notice a thing. Zeitz looked at Mark and waited for a reaction. Mark said he'd find the money. His voice sounded steady, and Mark himself was surprised by that steadiness. Zeitz buttoned his coat with satisfaction. At the threshold, he turned around and added that he sincerely wished him success, that he himself found the inconvenience unpleasant. The door closed. Footsteps faded on the stairs. Mark stood there, listening to his heart pounding. Then he turned toward the storage closet. The frost had grown all the way to the doorknob, which shouldn't have been there. The knob protruded through the wallpaper like a bone-through skin. The paper burst and curled up from the cold. Beneath it was not a wall. Beneath it was a door made of dark wood with iron strips and rivets. Mark had only seen doors like this in a museum. He touched the iron and pulled his fingers away. The metal burned with cold. A draft of winter and something else drifted in through the crack under the door. Smoke, old stone. Mark fetched a knife from the kitchen and pried at the edge. The door gave way with a crunch like breaking ice. Beyond it was a stone corridor 2 steps wide. The walls, made of rough blocks, glistened with frost. At the end of the corridor, a rectangle of light glowed. Mark stood on the threshold between July and winter and felt the heat from the window flowing down the left side of his body and the frost from the corridor on the right. His mind suggested closing the door and calling someone, but his mind couldn't specify exactly who. Mark went back into the room. He put on his winter jacket, which had been stored in the loft all summer. He grabbed his phone and a pocket knife. He propped the apartment's front door open with a chair. Then he stepped into the hallway. The cold closed in instantly. His breath came out in a cloud. The soles of his sneakers squeaked on the frost. 20 steps. The hallway ended at an archway, cluttered with debris on either side. Mark peered out and forgot all about Zeitz. The city lay before him. A narrow street wound downward between 3- and 4-story stone buildings. The roofs were hunched under meter-thick caps of snow. The windows on the first floors were boarded up. Only here and there did thin wisps of smoke rise from the chimneys. The sky hung low and gray like a cauldron lid, and in that grayness a dim spot floated where the sun should have been. The light was twilight-like, though it felt like daytime. Drifts of snow stretched along the walls, from beneath which the corners of abandoned carts jutted out. A fountain stood in the middle of the intersection. The water in it had long since frozen solid. The icy figure of a woman holding a jug was so encrusted with ice that only a faint shadow of her silhouette remained. The frost was so biting that Mark's cheekbones began to ache after a minute. 30 degrees below zero, maybe more. And that wasn't the scariest part. The scariest thing was the silence. A city this size should be buzzing. This city was silent. Only the wind swept dry snow across the street. Then Mark heard footsteps. 3 men in heavy fur coats, with spears on their backs, emerged from around the corner. Each had a copper badge hanging from his chest, a patrol. The one in front stopped and stared at Mark. Mark realized how he must look from the outside. A man in a light jacket and sneakers, standing knee-deep in snow in the bitter cold, with steam rising from him. The patrolman in front shouted something. The language was unfamiliar, but the intonation made the meaning clear. Without a dictionary. Stop! Mark didn't stop. He ducked back under the archway and ran down the hallway. Boots thundered behind him, icy steps, the doorway. Mark burst into the apartment, leaned against the door, and it slammed shut with that same icy crunch. He stood with his back pressed against the wood and listened. At first, there was silence. Then someone on the other side knocked on the door. Once, twice, then the knocking subsided, and someone scraped very quietly right by the doorknob. That's how a person scrapes when checking the lock. Holding his breath, Mark backed up to the middle of the room. Outside the window in the courtyard, children were shouting and the linden tree was in bloom. And on this side of the door, new feathers of frost were slowly forming on the wallpaper. And then there was another knock at the door, 3 times. Slowly, politely. That's not how a patrol knocks. That's how a guest knocks who knows the owner is home. The knocking repeated. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks. A patrol doesn't knock like that. A patrol breaks down the door. Mark grabbed a hammer from the kitchen just to have something in his hand and opened the door a palm's width. An old woman stood in the crack, a small, frail woman in a fur coat sewn from mismatched pieces of fur. Her face was darkened by the wind and all wrinkled like a baked apple. Her eyes were lively and piercing. She raised her open palms to show she was unarmed. Then she spoke and Mark flinched because he understood her. The words sounded foreign, but the meaning emerged in his mind on its own, with a slight delay, like a translation in an earpiece. Later, he would discover that this was a property of the door itself, which processed speech for anyone who passed through it. For now, he simply listened. The old woman said her name was Selda Vrun, that she collects the bones of the dead quarter and knows every passageway here, that this passageway had been a dead end for 20 years, but today a man had emerged from it who smelled of summer. She'd seen him slip away from the patrol into the dead end and not come back out. So the dead end wasn't a dead end anymore. She said this without a hint of threat, with businesslike interest. Then she asked if he had any salt. Mark thought he'd misheard her. The old woman repeated herself. Salt, white salt, even just a handful. Mark left her on the threshold, went to the kitchen, and returned with an opened half-kilo packet of salt. Seld took the packet as one would take a baby. She peeled back the edge. She licked her finger, dipped it in, and tasted it, and her chin trembled. She regained her composure in a second, but Mark had seen it. Then she untied the purse from her belt and placed a coin in his palm, a heavy yellow disc with the profile of a crown and an inscription around the edge. Gold. Mark held the coin and felt something inside him shift with a click. He asked how much salt cost here. Seldia replied that until winter, a sack of salt had cost a copper coin, that in the 10th year of winter, salt was priced by the weight of silver because the salt caravans from the south hadn't passed through the mountain passes for 4 years now. Without salt, they couldn't preserve meat and fish, and without those preserves, the neighborhood wouldn't survive the dark season. She spoke calmly, listing the prices as one might list the dead. Mark asked about the city. Selda told him, counting on her fingers. The city is called Velkarn. Winter came 10 years ago and hasn't left. The sun grows dimmer with each passing year. Heat is provided by the Coal Rose and the Brazier Guild, which charges triple the price for coal. Those who can't pay burn their furniture, then their books, and then die. The far end of the city has been swallowed by a white fog from which no one returns. People call it the Maw. Mark listened, and the numbers stacked up in his head like a cold column. Salt costs as much as silver. A gold coin for a pack from the supermarket that cost 40 cents. He asked what else was valuable here. Selda gave him a long look and said that her grandson was lying in her storeroom with a rotten leg and a fever. That the doctor of the dead quarter had died last year, and the guild doctors demanded payment in gold up front. If someone from a warm place had medicine, she'd pay the full price. For the first time, a crack appeared in her voice. Mark said he'd be back in an hour. He closed the door, sat down on the couch, and just breathed for 3 minutes. Then he opened his laptop and checked his balance. 192. That was all he had left before his scholarship came in. He went to the pharmacy on the corner and bought a broad-spectrum antibiotic, fever reducer, bandages, antiseptic, and painkillers. He also stopped by a store and picked up 4 packs of salt, 10 lighters, and a pack of batteries. His backpack was light, less than 5 kilos. With that backpack, he stepped back into the winter. Seldy was waiting in the archway. She led him through the alleys of the dead quarter, past houses with broken windows and doors crisscrossed with boards bearing a black mark. The mark meant there was no one alive inside. Zelda's tiny room was hidden in the basement of a former dye house. There, amid the rags, a 14-year-old boy was burning in the hot, dry heat. His leg was swollen and had turned a sickly red from a laceration below the knee. Mark wasn't a doctor, but he had instructions in a box and internet on his phone, as long as the phone could pick up even a signal, right by the door. He rinsed the wound, poured antiseptic on it, applied a bandage, crushed a fever-reducing pill in warm water, and made the boy drink it. He explained to Zelda how to administer the antibiotic, twice a day for 7 days without skipping a dose even if he started to feel better. Zelda looked at the white pills with obvious skepticism. She said she'd seen quacks selling crushed chalk during the plague. If her grandson's condition worsened, she'd find Mark even behind a solid wall. It wasn't gratitude, it was a promise. Mark came by twice more over the next 2 days. The first time, the fever had subsided to a bearable level, and the boy asked for food. The second time, he was sitting up, and the redness on his leg had faded by half. Zelda greeted Mark in silence. Then she took his hand and placed in his palm a second gold coin and a ring of dull silver with a cloudy stone. She said that the ring warmed the blood if worn on the finger, and that she'd taken it from a dead guild master. That there were few such things left in the city because the masters of warmth were the first to die. Strange, she said, looking away. The beggars were supposed to die first, but the sorcerers were the first to go. Mark slipped the ring onto his finger, and a steady warmth, like that of a hot water bottle, spread up his arm to his shoulder. Meanwhile, back on Earth, it was the second day of the deadline. Mark took 1 gold coin to the pawn shop on the waterfront. Arno the pawnbroker twirled it between his fingers for a long time. He weighed it. He dripped acid on it. He looked at Mark over his glasses and asked where a student had gotten a coin that wasn't listed in any catalogs and was purer than bank-grade gold. Mark replied that it was an inheritance from his grandfather. Arno smirked in a way that made it clear exactly what he thought of the inheritance. But he counted out the money, 1,900 per coin. Mark sold the second coin to a collector through an ad for 2,400 because he had managed to read up on numismatics. On the evening of the third day, he transferred 4,600 to Zeitz's office and received an automated receipt. He sat there looking at that receipt and realized 2 things. First, in just 3 days, he'd paid off a debt that was supposed to drown him for years. Second, he wasn't thinking about the debt anymore. He was thinking about sacks, about how salt is sold in 25-kilo sacks, about the fact that every pharmacy has a wholesale price list. That night, His landlady texted him. She asked why the neighbor downstairs was complaining about cold air coming from her riser in the middle of July. And in the morning, there was a knock at the door. Standing on the threshold was one of Mr. Zeitz's men. He politely informed Mark that Mr. Zeitz congratulated him on paying off the debt and asked if Mark needed any more money. Mr. Zeitz said he knew how to respect people who could come up with $4,600 in 3 days. Mr. Zeitz was very curious to know how they managed to do it. Zeitz's man stood in the doorway and waited for an answer. Mark said he'd borrowed from relatives and didn't need any new loans. The man nodded, jotted something down on his phone, and left. Mark watched him go and realized this wouldn't be the last visit. People like Zeitz don't trust relatives. People like Zeitz believe in sources. But there was no time to think about Zeitz because Zelda was already waiting for him at the door with news. The news was named Idron Volts, and he served as the manager of the Kaldwin House. The Kaldwin House controlled the eastern third of the city, and the governor of Velharna himself came from that house. The rumor about the white pills that had revived a rotting boy in a week reached the top faster than Mark could sell his second pack of salt. Zelda said that the House of Kaldwin could not be refused. That one does not turn down such invitations twice. The meeting was set for the cloth market near the Way Tower. Mark arrived and saw that Seldy wasn't there. Instead, 4 armored men in white cloaks stood across the market, along with a man in a black fur coat wearing the manager's silver chain. Idron Volts was tall and gaunt, and he looked the way one looks at a set of scales before weighing something. He didn't say hello. He said that the governor's daughter had been suffering from a lung fever for 11 days now. He said that the house's best physician, Master Oswin, had tried everything and ordered the crypt to be prepared. If a stranger from the warm lands could cure the girl, the House of Kaldwin would pay any reasonable price. Then he paused and added that if the girl died after taking his potions, the House of Kaldwin would set the price as well. Mark felt his finger grow sweaty beneath his ring. He replied that he needed to see the patient and that he needed a day to prepare the potions. At the Kaldwin mansion, he was led through a series of interconnected rooms where coal braziers burned in place of chandeliers, and the servant's breath hung in the air like steam. The girl was 9. She was burning up and wheezing, and her ribs moved beneath her skin like a bird's. Standing nearby was Maitre Oswin, an old man with a bitter expression, dressed in the robe of the Physicians' Guild. He looked Mark up and down and told the steward that the house had reached rock bottom if it was letting street charlatans with a bag in to see the heiress, that he had been treating this city for 40 years and would not allow a quack to finish off the child. Oswin was a skeptic of the highest order, and Mark unexpectedly felt a sense of respect for him. This old man was the only one here asking the right questions. Mark came back down to earth and did 3 things. He called a friend from medical school and spent 2 hours on the phone recording the conversation, asking him about pneumonia in children, dosages based on weight, and the signs that indicate it's too late to do anything. He bought 2 types of antibiotics, a fever reducer, a solution, and a pulse oximeter. And he bought a sleeping bag rated for -40 because he realized he'd have to spend the night there. After that time blurred into one long freezing corridor, Mark remembered 4 moments from it. The first night, when the saturation reading on the monitor dropped, and Oswin stood over him with a candle, muttering that a street magician was poking a child with a glowing clothespin. The third day, when her fever dropped below a dangerous level for the first time, and the girl asked for a drink on her own, while Oswin silently moved from the chair by the door to the chair by the bed. The 5th day, when she sat up on the pillows and asked Mark what kind of animal was drawn on his jacket, and Oswin took a bottle of antibiotics, held it up to the candle, and studied the label at length as if it were a sacred text. And on the 7th day, when Master Oswin met him alone in the gallery, the old man stood as straight as a stick. He said that for 40 years he had considered himself a doctor, but a week ago he learned that his whole life he had been a folk healer. He said this in an even voice, but his hands were trembling. Then he bowed, not as a servant, but as a master to a master, and asked for one thing. The next time Mark brought the white potions, let him also bring knowledge. He was willing to pay for the training as an apprentice. On the evening of the 7th day, Adrian Volz laid out Mark's payment on the table. A stack of 30 gold pieces. A leather case containing a milky white crystal that warmed the air within 3 paces, and a question. The manager asked where the goods came from. Mark recited the lie he'd prepared in advance. A distant southern enclave beyond the mountain passes. A secret trail. He couldn't say more or else the trail would be closed. Adrian listened with the expression of a man who can tell a lie from the truth, but understands that a cash cow isn't obligated to reveal where its pasture is. He said that the House of Caldwin was ready to buy everything: salt, medicine, lamp oil, warm glass, and especially light. He pointed to the solar lamp that Mark had left by the girl's bed. Light without fire or smoke, he said slowly. For light like this town would give up everything it has left. The next 2 weeks were spent setting everything up. Mark registered as a sole proprietor on Arno's advice. In exchange for a 10% cut, Arno became his buyer and money launderer. The first wholesale purchase: 20 sacks of salt, 10 boxes of medicine, 50 battery-powered lanterns, and 4 foldable solar panels. The first caravan. Mark and 2 silent porters from the dead quarter, hired by Selda, hauled it all through the corridor in a single night. The first warehouse, the basement of the dye house where Selda had stationed the bookkeeper because she thought she could calculate faster than Arno on a calculator, and the first consequences. In the coal markets, they noticed that the eastern third of the city had started buying less coal, that in the evenings, the windows of the Caldwin house glowed with an even white light without smoke, that in the dead quarter, which had long been written off as a loss, someone was heating the place and salting fish by the barrel. The Stovemakers Guild was run by a master named Gruff Malden, and Selda had this to say about him. 10 years ago, he was a coal peddler with a single cart. Now he owns a third of the city's heat supply and half of its I owe us. People like that don't ask questions twice. By the end of the 2nd week, tar had been smeared on the warehouse doors and the lock had been forced open. Nothing had been taken. It wasn't a robbery. It was a warning. And when Mark returned to spend the night on Earth, he saw from the stairwell that the door to his apartment was ajar and a winter draft was blowing through the crack into the summer stairwell. Mark climbed the stairs quietly, though he knew that silence wouldn't save anyone anymore. He pushed the door open. It was -5. Frost covered the wallpaper from the storage closet to the middle of the ceiling. The icy door stood wide open, and in the middle of the room, with his back to the exit, Zaitza was crouching, shining his phone's light into the frosty hallway. Hearing footsteps, he turned around without the slightest embarrassment. He said he'd stop by to check on some loan offers, and the door had been open. He said it and immediately realized how it sounded. Then he nodded toward the hallway and asked what that was. His voice wavered. Mark replied that it was a freezer, that he transported perishables. Zeitz's man slowly stood up. He wasn't a fool. Freezers aren't lined with medieval stone, and they don't smell of snow and smoke. He said that Mr. Zeitz would be in touch and left faster than politeness required. Mark locked both locks behind him, sat down on the floor by the icy door, and began to think. The door had been opened from inside the apartment. He remembered that he'd locked it with the bolt he'd screwed in that week. The bolt was still intact, so it hadn't been opened from this side. That meant from the other side. He scanned the hallway with his flashlight and found footprints in the frost right at the threshold. Narrow, barefoot. Human feet, but the toes were too long. The footprints led from the archway to the apartment's threshold and then stopped. There were no return footprints. Mark sat there with his hammer until dawn, but there was no one in the apartment besides him. In the mornings, he drew his conclusions. First, The door must be kept locked on both sides and monitored by a camera. Second, he shouldn't live here or store his merchandise here. He rented a garage in a cooperative near the freight station, a concrete box with an inspection pit and a gate secured by 2 locks. Over the course of a week, he moved his purchases there, set up shelving, security cameras, and a generator, leaving the apartment an empty shell with only a sofa and the ice-covered door remaining as furniture. It was impossible to move the door. He had checked. The door clung to the wall of that building like a root clings to the ground, so the apartment was becoming a passageway. Construction was underway on the other side, too. Zelda hired 8 people from the abandoned neighborhood, and the dye house basement was expanded with a vestibule, a guardhouse, and a second exit through the collapsed chimney. It was here that Mark first saw Neva. She was about 12 years old, skinny as a stick. She wore a men's sheepskin coat down to her heels, cinched at the waist with a rope. She had crawled into the warehouse through the chimney in broad daylight, pulled out a can of stewed meat, and was caught only because a white fox had followed her, got stuck in the narrow bend of the pipe, and let out a shriek. The dock workers wanted to lower the little thief down the ladder. Mark looked at her hands. Her fingers were covered in blackish-blue patches of frostbite. He ordered that she be fed. Neva ate silently and quickly, like an animal, glancing up at every sound, while the fox sat at her feet, never taking its amber eyes off Mark. LDA said the girl had been living in attics since winter, that the maw had taken her parents when the fog swallowed the harbor streets, that she'd pulled the fox out of a trap, and ever since, they'd been splitting their food 50-50. Mark offered Neva a job, eyes and ears. She knows the attics and the courtyards, and he needs to know everything that's going on from the coal yards to the square. Payment in food, medicine, and warm clothes. Neva thought it over and asked if the fox would get her own ration. The fox's name was Ira. That's how the warehouse got a scout and a sentry, because Ira's hearing turned out to be better than any alarm system. Through Neva, Mark learned more about the city in a week than he had in a month from Zelda. He learned that the Furnace Guild had raised the price of coal by another quarter to recoup their losses, that Gruff Malden was buying up the debts of those who had stopped buying coal and had already seized 2 bakeries for non-payment, and that in the Coal Rose, people were openly talking about the southern merchant who it's time to cut short. The attack came on the 9th night. Era pricked up her ears a minute before a crowbar smashed into the vestibule. There were 6 of them. 2 of them kicked down the vestibule door and splashed mountain oil on the threshold. 4 more waited outside with clubs in case anyone tried to escape. They'd calculated everything correctly, except for one thing. They'd come to set fire to the dark basement with the sleeping guards inside, but they'd walked right into the light. Mark shone 2 construction floodlights, powered by a generator in their faces, and the 6 of them were blinded for a few seconds in the midst of the eternal twilight winter, where none of them had ever seen such light. Then the pepper spray canister went off. Then the net that the movers had stretched across the vestibule. The 4 outside heard the howls from within and chose to vanish into the back alleys. 2 were tied up. 1 remained silent. The second didn't stay silent when Zelda promised to hand him over to the guards at the Caldwin house for the nighttime arson. Arson in a starving city was punishable by being impaled on a stake. He revealed that a foreman from the guild had hired them, that the order came from the very top, from Malden himself, and that Malden had been looking gloomy lately because the guild was paying a tithe to someone. The foreman didn't know exactly who. He only said that they came for the tithe at night, and that after these visits, frost remained in the coal cellars. Mark listened, and a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Frost left behind by the night visitors, barefoot footprints at his doorstep. He didn't have time to finish that thought. At noon the next day, there was a loud knock at the warehouse door. Standing on the threshold was a squire in a white Caldwin cloak carrying an embossed leather case. Inside the case lay a sheet of paper bearing a seal in the shape of a tower in ice. Lord Dagmar Caldwin, the governor of Velharn, was summoning the southern merchant to the citadel. The wording was polite. The deadline was tomorrow. At the bottom was a note in Idrin's handwriting. The manager advised him to come and not to lie any more than necessary. That evening, Mark returned to Earth to spend the night and gather samples of goods for the governor. He entered the courtyard of his house and stopped. In the middle of the July courtyard, beneath a blooming linden tree, stood a playground, a slide, a swing set, and a sandbox. Everything was white. Frost lay on the crossbars, on the chains of the swings, and on the edge of the sandbox. 2 residents stood nearby, filming it on their phones, and at the foot of the slide, 3 dead pigeons lay on their sides, their feathers frozen stiff. Mark looked up. The windows of his 4th-floor apartment were covered on the inside with a frosty pattern. None of the other windows were affected. Only his. First thing in the morning, Mark went up to his apartment. The frost inside had intensified to -15. Frost had crept up to the front door and was licking at it from the inside. He covered the icy door with 3 layers of construction plastic sheeting with insulation, taped the seams, and the cold in the room receded by a couple of degrees. It was no victory. It was a compress on a tumor. Then he packed a case with samples and headed out into the winter because the governors don't like to wait. The citadel of Velharn stood on a cliff above the city and was the only place where Mark had seen real fire in abundance. Fireplaces burned in every hall. Guards stood every 10 paces. Adrian Volz met him at the stairs and said only one sentence on the way up. He said that the Lord reads people like parish registers and that yesterday's council decision still stands. Lord Dagmar Caldwin turned out to be a broad, heavy man of about 50, with a face that had once been good-natured, but had then been frozen for 10 years. He sat at a table cluttered with maps and did not offer a seat. At first, he remained silent and watched. Then he said that yesterday, for the first time this winter, his daughter had gone sledding down the ice slide in the courtyard, and that he was personally indebted to the Southern merchant for that. His voice did not warm in the slightest as he spoke these words. Then he laid 3 items on the table: a solar lantern, an antibiotic package, and a packet of salt with an Earth-style label. He said that his people had spent a month collecting everything the merchant had sold in the city, that no southern enclave writes in such a language or packages salt in soft white stone that burns with a smoky flame, that the mountain passes had been dead for 4 years, and no trail could have been traversed, carrying a load of unbreakable glass. He spoke calmly, listing the facts like a prosecutor, and Mark felt the ice thinning beneath his feet. Then Dagmar asked directly. He asked which world the merchant came from. He uttered the word world as casually as he would say neighborhood. And from that casualness, Mark realized that resisting was pointless and dangerous. He replied that he came from a warm world through a passage that had opened on its own, a passage he would show to no one, for it was his only protection. He braced himself for anything, guards, shackles, demands, to hand over the passage. Instead, Dagmar leaned back heavily in his chair and said he'd thought as much. And then he told Mark something that made his fingers go numb despite the ring. Winter wasn't just a season. 10 years ago, in the old citadel on the northern cape, the Order of the Ice Sorcerers had performed a ritual. They wanted to open a passage to a vein of power. Something went wrong. Ever since, a rift has stood where the old citadel once stood, a rift people call the Maw of Frost.
A white mist creeps out of it, and wherever the mist passes, nothing living remains. The sun over the city grows dimmer with each passing year, as if the rift were drinking in the light itself. Before winter, 90,000 people lived in Velkarn. By this spring, only 27 remained. Dagmar unfolded the map, and his finger traced the neighborhoods devoured by the mist. The port,
the northern settlements, Temple Hill. Then he said the most important thing. The Maw isn't just devouring the city, the Maw is searching. Before he died, the captive sorcerer of the Order kept repeating one thing. The rift reaches for warmth, like a root reaches for water. It gnaws through the weak spots and opens doors for itself into warm worlds so it can drink them in. Sometimes the guards find traces at such vulnerable spots, narrow, barefoot tracks of a non-human foot. They're left by those the sorcerer called the Walkers of the Frost, the Rift's Scouts. Mark stood there, listening to his own pulse. Barefoot tracks at his doorstep, frost in the courtyard beneath the linden tree. His door had opened on its own after standing as a solid wall for 20 years, and it had opened an hour before he found it. All that time, he'd thought he'd found the passage, but the passage had been found before him. The maw had gnawed through his door, and he was simply the first to walk through that passage in the opposite direction. Dagmar, meanwhile, got down to business because he was a ruler, not a storyteller. He said that in the spring he was organizing an expedition to the Rift, 300 plate-armored soldiers and every sorcerer they could buy or beg for. The Order had nearly managed to seal the rift in the first year. The records had been preserved. There wasn't enough light or heat for people to survive near the maw for more than an hour, and now he saw light without fire and clothing in which a southerner walks through the frost as if it were autumn. He offered a contract. D. Caldwin would buy everything needed for the expedition from Mark: light, heat, medicine, and food. Payment would be in gold, artifacts, and a monopoly on trade throughout the city under the house's protection. In return, there was one condition. When the expedition reached the maw, the merchant would accompany the caravan, because no one but him knew how to handle his goods. Mark asked what would happen if he refused. Dagmar replied without a threat, which made it sound even more terrifying. He said that in that case, Mark could continue trading and watch as the rift devoured this world and gnawed at his own. The door that the maw had gnawed through once, it would gnaw through even wider. Mark signed the contract. His hand barely trembled. On his way back through the city, he was escorted by 2 armored guards, carrying the down payment and with his head full of numbers. It took everything to purchase supplies for 300 people: panels, lanterns, chemical heat packs, sleeping bags, antibiotics, and high-calorie rations. Even with the monopoly and the gold from the House of Caldwin, it took months of work and dozens of trips through the... At the warehouse, Neva was waiting for him with news that made the day seem even longer. That night, Malden's men had gotten into a fight with the night tithe collectors, and in the morning, they found the guild's basement on Coal Row, wide open. The coal was still there. The people were gone, there was frost on the floor and narrow barefoot tracks. By noon, Gruff Malden himself had sent a man to the warehouse with a short letter. The guild master wrote that he was willing to forget the misunderstanding regarding the arson and requested a meeting because the city now faced a common enemy. Mark tucked the letter into his shirt and headed for the archway because he'd had enough of winter for one day. He went up to the airlock apartment and stopped in the doorway before he could reach the second lock with his key. The plastic sheeting with insulation that he'd used that morning to cover the icy door lay on the floor, torn off in a single motion. A trail of narrow, barefoot footprints frozen into the linoleum stretched across the entire room from the storage closet to the window. The footprints reached the windowsill. The window was slightly ajar, and outside the window, below, lay the summer courtyard where children, oblivious to it all, were shouting on the playground, white with frost. Mark stood in the doorway of his own apartment, staring at the trail of footprints frozen into the linoleum. The footprints led to the open window. Outside the window was a summer evening, and the courtyard was full of people. He ran down the stairs, leaping over the steps. Everything in the courtyard looked normal, except for the white playground, which the residents had already cordoned off with tape. Children were screaming by the building entrance. Old women were sitting on a bench. No one was shouting or pointing. That meant the walker had gone unnoticed. Mark forced himself to think like a logistics expert rather than a terrified student. The creature came from a world where -30 is a thaw. Here, it's +25. To her, it's a furnace. She'll be looking for the cold. He opened a map of the neighborhood on his phone and swiped his finger across it. A grocery warehouse with freezers 2 blocks away. An ice rink on the waterfront. The basements of old buildings were its coldest. He started with the one closest by. Near the food warehouse, he saw a crowd and 2 emergency service vehicles. The warehouse workers were smoking off to the side, all talking at once about how the freezer room had gotten so cold in the space of an hour that the sensors had cracked. The automated system was reading -60, and the technicians didn't trust the readings. Mark didn't go any closer. He returned to the garage and packed a bag, 2 battery-powered construction floodlights, a heat gun, a pepper spray canister, and a hammer. On the way, he stopped at a hunting store and bought a thermal imager he'd had his eye on for a long time for winter hunting. That night, he returned to the warehouse. The emergency vehicles were gone. The facility had been cut off from power and sealed until morning. Mark walked around the building and found a ventilation hatch with a torn-off grate. The edges of the hatch were covered in frost. He climbed down into the intake tunnel and turned on the thermal imager. The screen showed a uniform gray haze, and within that haze, a black spot hung near the far wall. It wasn't warm, it was icy. A hole in the thermal image of the world, shaped like a slender human figure. The spot didn't move. Mark didn't move either. He stood there, listening to his own heartbeat, and realized that his plan had only taken him this far. Then, the spot turned its head. Mark flashed the lights. 2 spotlights flared up at once, flooding the tunnel with white light. The creature screamed. The sound was like scraping iron across glass. In normal light, it looked like a human sculpted from gray ice. Slender, faceless, smooth frost where its face should have been. It didn't lunge toward Mark, but away from the light, into a side passage, and Mark ran after it, dragging the heat gun. He chased it through the tunnels with the light, just as one drives a beast with fire. The creature darted about, leaving patches of frost wherever it touched the walls. At the dead end by the compressor room, it spun around. Mark turned on the heat gun. A jet of hot air struck the creature in the chest. It didn't catch fire. It began to melt. The ice where its face had been began to crack, and white steam poured out of the cracks. The creature took a step through the hot jet, and Mark saw that it would reach him. He dropped the heat gun and held up the spotlight like a shield. An icy palm pressed against the spotlight's housing, and the glass shattered from the temperature shock. The left side went dark. The creature leaned toward Mark, and he felt the wall against his back, and then a beam of light struck from behind his shoulder. He dropped the second spotlight while running, and it lay on the floor, its beam sweeping along the tunnel. The creature found itself caught between the 2 light sources, between the light and the heat. It froze mid-movement. Cracks spread across its gray body. Steam poured out of every seam at once. The creature collapsed into a heap of murky ice, and the ice melted before his eyes into a puddle, which then evaporated without a trace. All that remained was a patch of frost on the concrete. Mark slid down the wall and sat there for about 5 minutes. Then he forced himself to stand up and survey the tunnel. He found what he was looking for and what he feared. Everywhere the creature had stood for more than a minute, the frost had formed a pattern, not in random patterns, in a spiral, an identical spiral with a double curl in the center. He remembered seeing the same spiral on the ice at the playground, beneath the slide. The creature wasn't hiding or hunting. The creature was at work. It was leaving markers. In the morning, Mark came to the courtyard of his house with a heat gun, posing as an emergency service worker. The tape around the playground was still in place. The frost on the swings hadn't melted overnight, even though it had been a warm night. Beneath the slide, on the contrary, the ice had thickened and a spiral was clearly visible within it. Mark heated the spot with the blower for 3 hours and the ice melted away. The ground beneath it remained frozen to the depth of a palm. He realized he had cured the symptom, not the disease. At lunchtime, the apartment's owner called. Her voice was steely. She said she'd received calls from the property management company and the emergency service. She explained that the frozen pipe was originating from her apartment and that she would come by tomorrow with a repairman to inspect everything in person. Mark stared at his phone, realizing that tomorrow a stranger would see the icy door. That evening, he did the only thing he could think of. He bought the largest ready-to-assemble wardrobe available. 2 delivery men carried it into the apartment, and Mark placed the wardrobe right up against the storage closet, completely blocking the door. He stuffed insulation inside the wardrobe. From the outside, it looked like a piece of furniture against the wall. The landlady arrived with a repairman. The repairman tapped the walls, felt the radiators, and scanned them with a thermal imager while Mark stood behind him, clenching his fist in his pocket. The device showed a cold spot behind the wardrobe. The repairman said it looked like a damaged seam between the panels and that they'd have to open up the wall from the outside using a cherry picker. The landlady sighed after calculating the cost in her head and said she'd file a request with the management company, but there was a waiting list that would take months. Mark walked them to their car and promised to air out the place. When they drove away, he stood in the yard for a long time. A waiting list that would take months. That time frame suited him. Everything else didn't. That night, he returned to the Winter City and told Zelda everything. About the creature, about the spirals, about how the mark had appeared in his yard too. Zelda listened, her face turning to stone. Then she said something that made Mark's palms go cold. She said she'd seen spirals like that before, 10 years ago. A week before the fog swallowed the port, all the dock pilings had become encrusted with frost in the shape of spirals. People laughed and called them frost flowers. A week later, the port was gone. A spiral isn't a scout's mark. A spiral is an anchor. There is a place where the maw will come. Malden's letter had been tucked in his shirt for 2 days, and he couldn't put off the meeting any longer. Zelda insisted on her terms, a meeting on neutral ground at the inn by the weighbridge. At the neighboring tables sat 4 of Mark's porters. Neva was on the gallery under the roof with Ira. Mark arrived first and had time to survey the room. The tavern was heated with coal, at a quarter of its capacity, and the patrons were sitting in fur coats. Gruff Malden walked in unescorted, and that was the first thing worth knowing about him. The master of the Stove Makers Guild turned out to be a burly man with the hands of a coal burner and the eyes of an accountant. He sat down across from Mark, took off his mittens, and placed his heavy palms, scarred from old burns, on the table. He spoke slowly and looked straight ahead. He said that the warehouse fire had been his foreman's mistake, and that the foreman had already been punished. Mark replied that the foreman had been carrying out the master's orders, and that it wasn't worth starting the conversation with a lie. Malden was silent for a moment. Then he smiled with just the corners of his mouth and admitted that the order had come from him. That the southern merchant had taken 1/8 of the guild's sales over the past month, and anyone in his position would have sent people. But times had changed. He leaned across the table and spoke of the tithe. 3 years ago, night visitors had come to the guild's coal cellars for the first time. They didn't speak. They took 2 guards and left frost in their wake. A week later, a man with white eyes appeared before Malden and explained the rules. The guild leaves every 10th cartload of coal in the dead dock at the edge of the fog. As long as the coal burns there, the fog doesn't reach the coal rows. The guild had been paying for 3 years. Malden fed the maw so that the maw would devour other neighborhoods. He spoke of this calmly, though his hands on the table clenched into fists. But the night before last, the order broke down. The visitors came not for coal, but for people. They took 9 of them, including his eldest son. Malden fell silent and poured himself a drink from the jug. His hand didn't tremble, but the jug clinked against the rim of the mug. Then he said why he had come. He'd heard that a southerner was supplying the governor's expedition to Pashti. The guild wanted in. People, carts, coal, warehouses, and all that I owe us enough leverage over anyone in the city. In exchange, 2 conditions. The guild would receive a share of the heat trade after the war, and if any prisoners were found in paste, the guild would be the first to claim them. Mark didn't answer right away. He looked at the man who, 10 years ago, had been a coal peddler with a single cart and was now offering him half the city. He said that the share would have to be discussed with the House of Caldwin because the monopoly agreement had already been signed. But he had a counter-proposal. The guild would stop selling heat and start selling labor. The city's coal was running out, but solar panels and heaters would not. Someone had to install the panels, repair the streetlights, deliver goods, and train people. 100 trained guild members will receive jobs paid in gold by the House of Caldwin. Malden listened with the expression of a man being offered water instead of blood. He was a skeptic of the old school and didn't believe in light without fire. Then Mark did what he'd rehearsed. He took a folding panel, a lantern, and a heater out of his chest. He laid the panel out right on the table beneath the dim window. He plugged in the lantern. The lantern lit up. Malden stared at the wire running from the glass tube to the lamp and remained silent for a long time. Then he took the heater that Mark had snapped in half and turned it on. He held it in his scorched palms, and his face changed the way the face of a man recounting his entire life changes. He said quietly that he'd burned through 40 years and half his lungs to sell warmth to people. And it turns out you can gather warmth from the sky for free, even under a dead sun. He didn't sign a share in the trade. He signed a contract for work. That's how Mark ended up with 100 workers in warehouses all over the city, and the Guild of Firemakers gained a future. The problem came from where it was bound to come from above. Adrian Volz summoned Mark that very evening and laid a denunciation on the table. 3 guildmasters had written to the governor that the Southerner had colluded with Malden to bypass the guild, that the monopoly had been violated. Adrian looked at Mark with the gaze of a waymaster and waited. Mark laid out the contract next to him, where it stated in black and white that all sales went through the House of Caldwin, and the guild received payment for its work. Idrin read it twice. Then, for the first time in Mark's memory, he almost smiled and said that a merchant learns faster than winter sets in. He burned the denunciation in a brazier right in front of Mark. Meanwhile, back on Earth, a problem was brewing. Arno called in the middle of the night. The pawnbroker's voice sounded unfamiliar. He said that 2 men from Zeitz had come to see him that afternoon. They'd asked about gold of non-standard minting. They showed him photographs of the coins Mark had brought in. Arno didn't tell them anything, but as they were leaving, one of them remarked that the modest pawnshop's turnover had tripled in a month and that Mr. Zeitz knew how to read financial statements. Mark hung up the phone and realized the noose was tightening. Zeitz could see the icy corridor. Zeitz had tracked down the gold. All Zeitz had to do was put 2 and 2 together. The next few days were spent on the installation. Mark and the Malden workers installed panels on the Citadel's roof and in the square. And that evening, in the center of Velharn, white streetlights shone for the first time in 10 years, and people came in droves simply to stand in the light. Oswin brought 6 young doctors to the warehouse, and Mark gave them their first lecture on antiseptics while holding a phone with his lecture notes. Neva was put in charge of 3 more of these attic dwellers, and her network of eyes covered the city from the Citadel to the edge of the fog. And on Friday evening, Mark went up to the airlock apartment for a new shipment and froze on the stairwell. The apartment door was open, the light was on inside, the cabinet blocking the icy door had been moved a meter away from the wall, and on the sagging sofa, amid the frosty mist, sat Zeitz in a gray coat, warming his hands on a thermos. 2 men stood on either side of him, and one had a short-barreled gun slung over his shoulder. Zeitz looked up at Mark and said, "Good evening." He said he'd been thinking about the freezer for a long time, that he'd looked into the gold, the pawnshop's turnover, and the strange truckloads of salt being purchased, that there had been few real mysteries in his life, and he'd decided to solve this one himself. Then he nodded toward the frosted door and asked what was inside. Mark remained silent, calculating the distance to the stairs. Zeitz sighed, set the thermos on the floor, and said it would be easier this way. Either Mark opens that door right now and shows them what's inside, or they'll open it without him, and Mark himself will go to a place where conversations last a long time. He stood up, straightened his coat, and added that he sincerely didn't want to cause any trouble. Just the door. Just to take a look. Mark looked at Zeitz and weighed his options. There were 2 options, bad and very bad. Refusing meant the basement and a long conversation, after which they'd open the door anyway, but without him. Opening it meant letting into both worlds a man for whom everything in the world is divided into assets and liabilities. Mark chose a 3rd option. He said he'd open it and show them, but first, Zeitz would have to listen to the briefing because you could die in 10 minutes behind that door. He said this calmly and thoroughly, the way people talk about real danger, and that thoroughness had an effect. Zeitz ordered his men to get dressed. Mark handed them 3 down jackets, 3 pairs of gloves, and flashlights from the airlock's supplies. For himself, he took a backpack containing a first aid kit, hand warmers, and a pepper spray canister. Then he unlocked the bolts. A blast of winter air swept in from the hallway, and the guard standing behind Zeitz's back flinched. They walked down the hallway and stepped out into the archway. Velkar met them with the twilight of a dead neighborhood, boarded up windows, black marks on the doors. The temperature was below 30. Mark wasn't looking at the city, he was looking at Zeitz. Zeitz stood very still. A man who had considered himself a realist his whole life was looking at the frozen fountain of a foreign world, and his mental catalog was burning away before his eyes. The gunman behind him was cursing under his breath, repeating the same 3 words over and over. Mark gave them 5 minutes, then said it was time to head back because the cold was no joke. And then Ira screamed. A fox-like scream rang out from the roof of the dye house, short and terrifying. Mark managed to shout into the light, though he didn't even understand where the knowledge had come from, that he needed to shout exactly that. 3 walkers were coming toward them from a side alley. The thin, gray figures moved not quickly, but inexorably, and wherever they stepped, the snow stopped crunching. The gunman raised his barrel and fired twice. The bullets passed through the lead walker with a ringing sound, as if through ice, and changed nothing. From then on, everything was decided in a matter of seconds. Mark yanked a flare, bought after that night in the freezing plant, out of his backpack, and lit it. The crimson flame hissed, scattering sparks, and the walkers froze as if staring at glass. From the back, out of the dye house doors, loaders were already running with a floodlight on a cart. The light swept across the street. The men turned around and headed into the alley, not running, but simply stopping their advance, and this sudden stillness was worse than the chase itself. Zeitz's second man was sitting in a snowdrift where panic had knocked him down, and it took 2 of them to lift him up. They walked back through the hallway in silence. In the apartment, Zeitz stood by the window for a long time, looking out at the summer courtyard. Then he sat down on the couch and said he was ready to discuss the terms. Mark replied that Zeitz wasn't the one setting the terms here, that Zeitz had seen the goods, seen the market, and seen the risk. Bullets don't work there, but the creatures that roam there are already coming here, and the freezer plant on the embankment is their operation. Mark could make Zeitz part of the supply chain, or he could leave him alone with the knowledge that has nowhere to go, because any story about the door ends with the orderlies. Zeitz listened, and for the first time in Mark's memory, he smiled genuinely. He said that for 20 years he'd been collecting debts from people who had no future. And now, finally, he saw a business that did have a future. They agreed on the following. Zeitz's office would become the Earthside Logistics operation. Wholesale purchases through front companies, cash transactions, 1 truck, and 2 full-time employees. A 15% cut from the Earth side. Weapons aren't allowed through the door at all, and Mark hammered this condition home, explaining that anyone who transports guns there will bring war upon both worlds. Zeitz haggled for appearance's sake, but his eyes were already focused elsewhere. He asked about the creatures, about what would happen when there were more of them. Mark answered honestly that things would get bad, and that was precisely why he was supplying the expedition meant to seal the rift. Zeitz nodded and said something that Mark couldn't shake for a long time afterward. He said that for the first time in his life, he was funding the side of good, and that the feeling was strange but pleasant. The operation got underway in 2 weeks. It was a quick setup. Zeitz's truck would pull up to the garage at night, and shelves grew to the ceiling inside the garage. Arno got an assistant and stopped shuddering at the word audit. Convoys began passing through the door on schedule. 3 trips a night along the well-trodden corridor. Salt, flour, oil, medicine, panels, lanterns, hot water bottles, sleeping bags. The warehouse and the dye house could no longer hold everything, so Malden set aside 2 coal cellars for the goods. Food prices in Velharn had fallen by 2/3 over the course of a month, and at the market by the weighing tower, for the first time in years, goods were sold from counters rather than from vendors' hands. Azen saw patients in the scrubbed clean hall of the old bathhouse, above which Malden's workers had raised the roof. His 6 apprentices were already administering injections and keeping records on their own. The governor sent Mark a letter bearing the tower's seal, in which Mark was named a supplier to the court, which meant his people could move throughout the city, except for the citadel, without being searched. The city was coming back to life, and it was plain to see. And then 2 pieces of news arrived in a single day, both of them bad. The first was brought by Neva. The edge of the fog had shifted. Over the past 10 years, people had grown accustomed to the maw creeping forward at a rate of an elbow's length per week. Over the past week, the fog had swallowed an entire street, 40 paces. Its speed had increased exponentially, and fresh spirals had appeared along its edge. The second piece of news came from a TV on Earth. Mark was having dinner in the garage, and the local news was on the screen. The anchor was cheerfully reporting on an anomaly on the waterfront. The freezer section of the grocery warehouse had frozen over again after being disconnected from the power grid. In the neighboring block, 2 cars had frozen solid overnight, so their engines had to be thawed out with blowtorches. Meteorologists were at a loss. A physicist from the university was brought into the studio, and the physicist said something that made Mark stop chewing. He said that the local anomalies formed a pattern on the city map. If you plotted all the freezing points, they would form an arc, and this arc curved around a single neighborhood. The camera showed the map. The arc of cold spots gently encircled Mark's neighborhood, with the airlock apartment at its center. The maw wasn't searching blindly. The maw was circling its prey. Dagmar listened to the report on the fog's acceleration while standing over the map, and for the first time, Mark saw the governor's knuckles turn white. Then the Lord said that spring was canceled. The expedition would set out in a month, or the city wouldn't survive until then. But first, reconnaissance was needed. The Order's records were kept in the old observatory on Temple Hill, and Temple Hill had been swallowed by the fog 6 years ago. There was a second objective as well. Rumors were circulating among the prisoners that one of the Order's sorcerers had holed up in the observatory until the very end, and that a light had been seen in its window even after the fog had arrived. If anyone from the Order is still alive, he knows more about the rift than anyone else alive. They assembled a small reconnaissance party. Faster and quieter. 10 plate-armored soldiers under the command of a gray-haired captain named Torvald. Oswin because they needed a healer. Mark because no one but him knew how to handle the equipment. And Nava and Ira because Ira could sense the walkers a minute before they appeared, and not even Torvald argued with that. Up close, the edge of the fog was worse than the stories had made it out to be. A white wall stood across the street, stretching from the ground to the sky. It didn't swirl, but breathed. It slowly advanced and receded like the chest of a sleeper. The houses were half submerged in it, and the edge was smooth as if the world had been cut off with a knife. Mark handed out the equipment to the group, equipment he'd been thinking about for 2 weeks. Headlamps, chemical hand warmers to wear under their clothes, a climbing rope for the entire chain. And most importantly, 6 spotlights on sleds with batteries arranged in a cube of light. The plan was simple. Hikers don't walk into bright light, so the group would carry the light with them like a tent. We entered the fog in a tight formation. Inside, there was no wind and no sound. The fog hung thick on all sides, and the lights pierced it for about 5 steps. The temperature inside dropped so low that Mark's thermometer hit the bottom mark. The hand warmers burned under his jacket, but his face under the mask still didn't freeze. They followed the Neva's navigation system, which knew the Temple Hill by heart and moved along the cable like the blind. Twice, Era pressed her ears to the ground, and the group bristled, shining their spotlights outward. Both times, something passed by in the milky darkness beyond the edge of the light. Something big, bigger than a walker. There was no sound of footsteps. There was only the creaking of snow under their weight. It took them 2 hours to climb the hill. The observatory stood above the fog like an island, a round tower with a copper dome, and for some reason the fog flowed around its base without closing in. And in the narrow window beneath the dome, a light was burning, the living, yellow flame of a candle. The tower door opened before Torvald could knock. Standing on the threshold was an old man in an order's robe, scorched at the hem, thin to the point of transparency, with white eyes veiled by a frosty film, yet he could see. He surveyed the group, his gaze lingering on Mark, and said, "At last." He said he had been waiting 6 years for a man who smelled of a foreign summer. The old man's name was Vesper Odd, and he was the orders keeper of the calculations. He was the one who verified the ritual formulas and the only one who, on the night of the ritual, stood not within the circle but behind the instruments. That was why he had survived. Inside, the tower was cluttered with books, and the ice had left them untouched because Vesper maintained what he called a standing wave around the observatory, a remnant of the ritual's protective barrier. He seated his guests by the hearth, where a fire burned without needing firewood, and told them everything in order. The order did not want winter. The order wanted warmth. Calculations had revealed a vein of power beyond the edge of the world, and the ritual was supposed to open a subtle channel to it. But a sign error had crept into the calculations, a single stroke in a single formula. The channel opened not to the vein, but to the other side, to the cold side, from where power does not flow, but into which it sinks. A rift is not a door. A rift is a drain. It drinks in warmth, light, and life, and will never be filled because the other side has no bottom. Vesper spoke as calmly as one reads a sentence, and only his fingers kept tracing the same line in the air over and over. That very one. Then Mark asked about the spirals and the walkers, and Vesper looked at him with a long, blank stare. He said that the rift is blind, but not stupid. It stretches along the gradient like a route toward water. Its walkers are its feelers. Its spirals are its anchors. Where the anchor is set, the inside may push through a weak spot and open a passage. Mark told him about his door, about 20 years of a blank wall, about how the door had opened an hour before the collector's visit. Vesper listened and nodded, and then said what Mark already knew but had hoped not to hear. The door has been gnawed through from the inside. It's a reconnaissance passage to the big, warm world, and every time Mark carries warm food and living people through the passage, it wears down. The trade that saves Velharn is simultaneously paving the way for the other side to reach Earth. The arc of cold spots around the neighborhood is the preparation for the opening. It grew very quiet. Oswin stared into the fire. Torvald looked at Mark. Mark asked if it was possible to close the rift. Vesper replied that it was. The calculations had been corrected long ago. A return circuit is needed right at the maw itself. A lot of heat and light are needed at the moment of closure because the circuit is built by people and people die at the rift. And one last thing is needed. At the moment of closure, all anchor passages must be extinguished. All the doors have been gnawed through from the inside. Extinguished means they're closed forever on both sides. Vesper said this, looking Mark straight in the face with his white eyes. If the circuit closes, the door between the worlds will cease to exist. Mark will remain on whichever side he chooses to stand on at that moment. There will be no turning back. They made their way back along the same cable through the same milky mist, and Mark didn't remember the path because the same thought kept pounding in his head. To close the rift meant choosing a world forever. At the edge, when there were 50 steps left to fresh air, Era didn't scream. She howled, and the milk ahead parted. The creature was 2 stories tall, a walker, but overgrown, many-armed. Searchlights struck it, and the light stuck in the gray ice, not pushing it aside, but only slowing it down. Torvald bellowed for them to form a line. The armored guards closed ranks around the sled. And then Vesper Odd, who had tagged along with the group because he'd refused to die in the tower, stepped forward, raised his hands, and the symbol he'd been tracing in the air for 6 years landed for the first time, not in a void. The air in front of the creature thickened into glass. The creature struck the glass, and the glass withstood 3 blows. On the 4th, Vesper fell to his knees and shouted for them to run. The group surged through the edge, dragging the sled and the old man, and spilled out into the crisp frost, which, after the fog, seemed warm. The creature did not follow them out. It stood in the mist right at the edge and remained there as they walked away. It stared without eyes. It was memorizing everything. Mark had forbidden himself to make a choice. There was a month left before the expedition, and he intended to live out that month as if the question did not exist. Vesper was housed in the citadel under guard, and the old man, along with Oswin and 2 scribes, set to work translating the order's calculations into a work plan. Mark read the list they produced 3 days later while sitting because standing was too difficult. The reverse circuit required 12 nodes around the maw. Each node was a platform with people, light, and heat that had to hold out for an hour at the very edge, where an ordinary person would die in 10 minutes. Vesper calculated the need for light and heat in his own units. Mark converted them to his own, and the result was terrifying. 60 floodlights, half a metric ton of batteries, 8 generators with fuel, 400 sets of top-of-the-line winter clothing, thousands of hand warmers, tents, stoves, fuel, wiring, and food for 1,000 people for a week. On Earth, an order like that wouldn't be assembled in a single store or even in a single city. Mark brought the list to Zeitz, and Zeitz read it with growing respect. Then he said that for a volume like that, they'd need 3 companies and a larger warehouse, and that he had a contact at a wholesale company specializing in industrial equipment. A month began that Mark later couldn't recall in its entirety, only in fragments. Fragment 1, nighttime and trucks at the garage, 2, then 3, then 5 a week. The hallway in the apartment was widened by removing the doorframe of the storage room, and boxes flowed through it like an assembly line. Meanwhile, Zeitz, through a front man, offered to buy the entire apartment at a price above market value, and the landlady agreed within a week. By that time, the cold snap surrounding the neighborhood had made federal news, and housing prices in the area had dropped so much that the deal seemed like a stroke of luck. Cut to the second scene. Velkarn had been converted into a workshop. Malden set up assembly yards in the coal yards where 100 guild members, led by Mark and 2 electricians hired on Earth, who had been told they were installing a polar station for a film shoot, were assembling lighting rigs on sled platforms. Torvald's carpenters were learning to move in teams and form a line. Neva sent her attic dwellers along the edge and plotted fresh spirals on the map, and spirals now appeared every night. Cut 3. Oswin's bathhouse, where classes were held in the evenings. Oswin was drilling 20 new orderlies on frostbite, fractures, and shock, while Vesper at the next table was teaching 6 surviving half-baked sorcerers in the city to maintain a standing wave for at least a minute. The standing wave turned out to be the only thing stopping the big walkers, and the 6 half-baked sorcerers were the world's entire magical reserve. Cut 4. Earth. The arc closed into a ring. Frost patches appeared throughout the neighborhood every 100 steps, and the management company, having finally breached the building's wall, found ice behind the panel that wouldn't melt with a torch. The building's residents were relocated within a week under the emergency housing program. Mark watched as neighbors loaded their belongings into moving vans, and as an old woman from the second floor wept over her flower pots, realizing he was witnessing Earth's first evacuation. It's just that no one but him knows that it's her. The city cordoned off the neighborhood with tape, declared a geological anomaly, and set up checkpoints at the entrances. The airlock apartment turned out to be inside the restricted zone, and this unexpectedly worked in Mark's favor because there were no outsiders left in the neighborhood at all, and Zeitz had an acquaintance at the checkpoint. Cut 5. The conversation Mark had been avoiding for a month. Seldy caught him in the warehouse 3 days before departure and asked him, point blank. She asked which side he would take when the circuit closed. Mark replied that he hadn't decided. Seldy looked at him for a long time, then said that the decision shouldn't be made between worlds, that worlds are just rocks and snow. The decision must be made between the people who will stay with him and the people who will be left without him, and she left, leaving him to grapple with it. They set out at dawn on the 10th day of the month of frost. The column stretched from the citadel to the way tower, and all of Velharn lined the streets. 300 plate-armored soldiers from the House of Kaldwin. 110 Guild Malden soldiers with sled platforms for the command posts. A supply train of 40 carts. Oswin with the medics. Vesper in a wagon piled high with books. 6 misfits. Neva and Era in the advance guard because everyone, including Torvald, was tired of arguing with her. And Mark was with the supply train, a radio strapped to his chest, a device to which all the node commanders had been trained. Dagmar Caldwin rode ahead in black armor, and the people on the streets were silent, not out of fear, but because they fall silent when words seem trivial. They reached the edge by noon. Fog hung across the entire northern route and seemed to breathe. According to Vesper's plan, on the first day, they were to clear and illuminate the road to the first line of defense. The old market square, 1,500 paces inland. The light nodes descended from their platforms, and 12 white domes flashed one after another, forming a wedge. The plate-armored soldiers took up positions in groups between them. Vesper raised his hand, and the trainees behind him grabbed the shared rope as if they were drowning. The column entered the fog, and for the first time in 10 years, the fog receded from the people. The light pierced it for 20 paces, and in that light they marched on and on, reclaiming street after street. Mark walked at the third node, listening to the broadcast, and almost believed the plan was working. They'd covered 1,000 steps in 2 hours and lost only one generator. And then Ira howled from the lead patrol, and all 6 misfits sprang to life at once, shouting in unison about the wave. The fog ahead at the market square did not part. It rose. It stood like a wall, taller than the houses, and in this wall, openings appeared like windows, and figures stood in those openings. Dozens of thin gray figures in rows. And in front of the rows, one stood alone, tall, in a long robe frozen to a glassy sheen. And when she stepped out of the fog into the light of the knots, the light around her went out, not shattered, but simply extinguished, like a blown-out candle. Vesper in the cart stood up to his full height. Mark heard the old man exhale a single word. A name, he said, Astren, and added more quietly that this was the first master of the order. The one who stood at the center of the circle on the night of the ritual, the one who was supposed to die first. Astren walked across the square, and the light died away before him in waves. The first node went out when he was 100 paces away. It didn't shatter or turn off. It simply ceased to be light, as if someone had erased it from the world. The guards at the first node recoiled, and the formation began to break even before the blow struck. Torvald bellowed into his radio to hold the line, and his voice broke into a rasp. Mark stood by the third node and watched as rows of gray figures emerged from the fog behind the Magister. He counted 40 and stopped counting. Vesper climbed out of the cart and was led by the arms by 2 misfits. The old man shouted that Estrina must not be allowed anywhere closer to the units than the flight of an arrow, that the Magister had become a rift with his own mouth and was extinguishing not lamps but the very right of light to exist beside him. Dagmar made his decision in 3 seconds. He ordered the first and second knots to fall back behind the third, and the armored soldiers to set fire to everything flammable between themselves and the Magister. Barrels of oil and torches flew onto the snow. A strip of fire stretched across the square, and the walkers stopped before it. Astren did not stop. He stepped into the fire, and the flames around him curled into black flakes. But he slowed down. Mark saw this clearly. The Magister extinguished the light as easily as a candle, but he had to struggle to put out the fire. The living flame resisted longer than the lamps. Vesper saw the same thing and howled in frustration that he hadn't realized it sooner. The order's calculations treated light and heat as a single quantity, but the underside consumed them differently. The retreat lasted an hour and cost 9 lives. The walkers cut through the flanks where the light ended, and the armored soldiers learned a terrible lesson. A squad of 3 held off a single walker. 2 died. The large walker, the very same 2-story one from the fog near the observatory, emerged on the left flank and swept aside 2 squads before the novices could form a standing wave in front of it, and the guild pelted it with burning oil.
The creature burned and melted and screamed in a glassy voice, and Mark remembered that scream forever.
By twilight, the column had retreated to the very edge and set up camp within a ring of fire, because fire was now more precious than light. The Astrans did not pursue them. He remained standing in the middle of the reclaimed 1,000 paces, alone among the darkened streets, and stood there all night without moving. The sentries watched him through their spyglasses and were driven mad by his immobility. That night, in the command tent, they tallied their losses and argued until they were hoarse. Dagmar demanded an answer from Vesper as to why the order's records about the Magister. Vesper replied that Astrid had perished in the ritual before everyone's eyes, that he had been the first to be drawn into the rift, and that if he had emerged 10 years later, it wasn't him. The other side does not return. The other side carries. What walks in the Magister's body is the hand of the rift, clad in a human glove. And then Vesper fell silent mid-sentence, and Mark saw the old man's expression change. Vesper whispered that the hand in the glove was not a source of strength, but of weakness. The rift is blind. To act with subtlety, it needs an anchor made of a human. Astrid is its only eyes and hands on this side. All the spirals of all the walkers converge not on the maw, but on him. If the anchor is torn out, the rift will go blind, and for the duration of the circuit's closure will become nothing more than a hole. By morning, they'd rewritten the plan. The circuit wouldn't be built as a ring around the maw right away, but as a horseshoe. The open end of the horseshoe is a trap for the master. He must be lured inside, pinned down with fire and a wave, and held there until the 12th knot closes the ring behind his back. The bait at the open end of the horseshoe must be the hottest and most vibrant thing the expedition has to offer. Vesper looked at Mark and said that the other side has been drinking this cool-down world drop by drop for 10 years. But a man who walks between worlds smells like a whole warm world. To the blind rift, Mark is the brightest bonfire for 100 years around. The Magister will come for him. The tent fell silent. Dagmar said he wasn't ordering such a thing. Mark replied that the governor couldn't order such a thing anyway. It's goods not included in the contract. He paused and added that he agreed. In the morning, a message arrived from Earth. The radio couldn't reach across the worlds, so communication was handled by courier. Neva ran back and forth to the arch with notes. Zeitz's note was short, and it made Mark's jaw clench. The ring of cold around the neighborhood had shrunk by half overnight. The perimeter had frozen solid, so the police had withdrawn their posts. In the center of the ring, at Mark's house, steam was billowing from every fourth-floor window as if from an open freezer. Zeitz wrote that he'd heard a sound coming from inside the house during the night, as if a great many bare feet were descending the stairs. He asked how much time he had and what to do. Mark sat poring over the note, realizing there was no time to spare, either there or here. The other side was preparing its entry point on Earth and had no intention of waiting for their war to end. He wrote a reply. Move all the floodlights, generators, and fuel to the garage. Douse the perimeter of the garage with oil. Don't try to be a hero. If creatures come out of the house, set everything on fire and retreat. And he wrote the last line, the slowest of all. He wrote that in 2 days it would all be over one way or another, and that if the door went out, Zeitz should give Arno the garage keys and keep everything else for himself. Neva took the note and looked at Mark as if she'd read it right through the envelope. She asked if it was true that when the big hole was sealed, his door would die too. Mark didn't lie. Neva was silent for a moment. Then she said that on this side of the door, he had a warehouse, a guild, and a clinic, all of them, while on the other side, there was just a box of belongings and people who wanted his money. She said this so he wouldn't do something foolish out of a sense of nobility, and she ran off toward the archway before he could come up with an answer. That afternoon, the camp set a trap. The guild's Malden members cut down a horseshoe-shaped fortification from sled platforms and shields. The units were rearranged according to a new formation. The trainees, under Vesper's leadership, rehearsed their coordinated charge until they had nosebleeds. Oswin set up a field hospital in the customs house they'd recaptured from the fog, and his orderlies carried the 9 dead to the temporary ossuary in silence, and that silence spoke louder than any words. By evening, everything was ready. Mark stood at the open end of the horseshoe on a pedestal made of crates with burning braziers on either side, feeling like a commodity in a shop window. Vesper told him to think of summer the moment the attack began, of the heat, of everything warm he could remember. The underworld is blind, but it distinguishes smells better than a dog. The sun had set, the fog began to rise more thickly. And across the darkened square, a solitary figure in a frost-covered cloak moved toward the horseshoe, followed silently by gray ranks. Astrid was walking toward Mark, and Mark thought of summer. He thought of the linden tree in the courtyard, the scorching garage roof, and how the asphalt melted under the sun. It was easy, because fear had burned away everything else. The Magister was approaching, and the braziers on either side of the pedestal were going out one by one, not because of the wind. The gray ranks were drawn into the horseshoe behind him like a thread through a needle. Torvald, in the darkness behind the shields, was counting aloud into his radio. 100 paces, 80, 60. At 50, Mark saw the Magister's face. Beneath the glassy crust of ice, the human face of an older man with closed eyes remained intact. Astron was walking blindly. He was, in fact, blind. It wasn't him who was looking. At 40 paces, Vesper gave the order. The world erupted in fire. The guild members set the oil-filled moats ablaze along the entire perimeter of the horseshoe, and walls of flame rose to the right, left, and behind the gray ranks. The 12th unit on the sleds burst across the open end, and its searchlights struck Astron in the back. The novices howled in six-part harmony, and the air above the horseshoe thickened into a standing wave like a transparent dome. The trap had closed. What followed was an hour that would have been enough for 3 lifetimes. The walkers burned in the oil-filled moats and clawed their way over their own melted comrades. The armored warriors struck them from the shield lines with spears whose tips were wrapped in burning tow. A large walker broke through the western shield and became bogged down in the wave, where it was engulfed in fire, and in the center of the horseshoe stood Astron, killing the trap simply by existing. The fire around him curled away. The wave above him sagged. Vesper stood 30 paces away from him, tracing symbols in the air with both hands while blood flowed from the old man's nose and ears. From his pedestal, Mark saw the air quivering between the two of them. The duel was being fought not in flames, but in spells. Vesper etched a corrected symbol into space, while the other side erased it through Astron. It was like two people writing and crossing out on the same slate, and the old man was losing because the other side's hand never grew tired. Mark did something that wasn't part of the plan. He grabbed the brazier by its cold handle from the pedestal and set toward the Magister himself. The calculation was purely instinctive. The other side senses him as the bonfire of two worlds. So when the bonfire moves, the eyes of the rift will turn after it. He walked and shouted out everything warm that came to mind about July, about asphalt, about hot tea. The blind face beneath the ice turned toward him. The pressure on Vesper eased for 3 seconds. 2 were enough for the old man. He shouted the entire formula, and for the first time in 6 years, the line he'd been drawing was finally completed. The standing wave crashed down like a clapping hand. Not onto the square, just onto Astron. The dome contracted into a cocoon around the magistrate and froze. Inside the cocoon, Astron stopped halfway. From outside, he could hear the fire roaring and people screaming, and nothing else. The gray ranks across the entire horseshoe froze simultaneously, like marionettes whose strings had been let go, and then they began to settle into piles of murky ice. The anchor had been torn out. The rupture was blinding. Vesper lay in the snow, and 6 of the misfits were holding him down. He was alive, but as transparent as paper. He whispered that the cocoon would hold out for at most 2 days, that within those 2 days they needed to build the circuit and close the loop, and that Astrina inside the cocoon must not be killed. As long as the anchor remained intact, the inside would be drawn to it rather than seeking new eyes. If he died, the rift would grow a new one from any dead sorcerer within an hour, and there were 300 dead sorcerers in this city. Mark spent the night after the battle in 2 worlds. First, the camp, 21 casualties. Oswin performed surgeries until dawn. Dagmar went from campfire to campfire, keeping silent with the men, and he was better at that than at speaking. Then the Arch and Earth. At Mark's garage, he met Zeitz, who had aged 10 years in a single week. The perimeter of the garage looked like a military facility. Searchlights on the roof, barrels in the corners. 2 of Zeitz's men were sleeping in the car in shifts. Zeitz reported as one would report to superiors. Last night, 6 creatures had emerged from the house. They weren't heading for the garage. They walked in an arc along the frozen ring, and at every cold spot, they would stop and stand for an hour. Zeitz shone a spotlight on them from a distance, and they didn't react. In the morning, they returned to the house. Mark listened and understood. The other side had gone blind here too. The creatures were finishing the mouth of the tunnel blindly, following the pre-programmed sequence. This bought time, but the program would run its course even without eyes. He told Zeitz the truth. The whole truth. About the circuit, about the 2 days, and about how, when the circuit closed, the door would die. Zeitz listened without interrupting. Then he asked on which side of the door Mark planned to stand at that moment. Mark replied, "On that side." Zeitz nodded as if he'd heard exactly what he expected. He said that after a month on the job, he'd realized one simple thing. On this side, Mark had his suppliers. On the other side, he has his people. Then he pulled a set of garage keys from his pocket and held them out, saying that since the inheritance had been promised to Arno, let Arno struggle with the paperwork. He'd already earned everything he needed. And for the first time since they'd met, Zeitz extended his hand first. Mark spent the rest of the night making his final trips. Everything left in the warehouses went out the door. Medicines, tools, seeds, and books on medicine and engineering that he'd been buying up for a month from used bookstores. Trip after trip, he hauled
Boxes and caught himself saying goodbye to the courtyard, to the linden tree, to the summer air in the hallway. On his last trip, he stopped in the middle of the apartment and looked around.
A worn-out sofa, a shelf with logistics textbooks. His entire former life would have fit into a single backpack, and he took nothing from it except a photograph of his parents, whom he didn't remember, and a textbook he'd once bought with his first scholarship. In the morning in Velkarn, construction of the circuit began. 12 nodes set out from the edge toward Pasta along the cleared streets, and now no one was dimming their lights. Anchorless walkers wandered alone and got caught in the fire of the barricades. By noon on the second day, the frontline node reached the northern cape, and Mark saw the maw of Stuja with his own eyes for the first time, where the old citadel once stood. A wound hung in the air. Not a hole nor a crater, simply the place where the world ended. One could not look there for more than a second because one's eyes began to hurt, as if from reverse welding. The wound radiated not cold, but a sense of absence, and standing in a ring around it were pillars of blue ice, and frozen into the pillars, dozens of people with their eyes open. Mark heard heavy breathing nearby. Malden stood looking at the third pillar from the left, where the face of a young man in his 20s was visible through the ice. The guild master removed his glove and placed his bare palm on the ice, and the ice beneath his palm began to crack. The ice beneath cracked, and steam rose from the fissure. Vesper shouted from the cart not to touch the pillars. He had been carried to the ring on a stretcher because he could no longer walk, and without him no one else could. He examined the pillar up close and said something terrifying in a calm voice. The people inside the pillars are alive. The other side did not kill them, but froze them on the border of life and drinks their warmth drop by drop as from long vessels. The pillars are the maw's nourishing circle, and at the same time, they are plugs. 40 living bodies have sealed 40 weak spots along the edge of the wound. If a pillar is broken before the circuit closes, the maw will burst forth from beneath it. Malden listened with his palm pressed against the crack and did not remove his hand. He asked if they could be saved. Vesper replied that it was both possible and impossible at the same time. The pillars must exit the circle at the moment the circuit closes, not before and not after. In that brief window, when the contour is already pressing against the wound, but has not yet sealed it. Any sooner, and the muzzles will strike. Any later, and it will be death along with the wound, because everything inside the contour will cease to exist upon closure. According to calculations, the window lasts the time it takes to say a short prayer. During this time, 40 pillars must be split, heated, and pulled out simultaneously by 40 teams. Dagmar said it was impossible. Malden said that the Guild of Braziers had been splitting and heating ice for 40 years, and that for his people, it was simply a shift's work. He was already turning around and yelling at the foreman about furriers' knives and braziers. Mark was left with the logistics of the impossible. 24 hours to prepare. He set up a field headquarters near the ring and turned the rescue into an assembly line. Each team had a numbered post. At each post stood a brazier sled, a supply of hand warmers, a sleeping bag, and Osvina, the medic. Rehearsals were held on the whistle, on ice blocks set aside. A strike on the mark, as indicated by Vesper, followed by a warm-up sprint and a run beyond the boundary line with the body on the sled. The standard was set at 40 heartbeats, and by evening, 28 out of 40 teams met it. Malden personally pushed the rest to their limits that night. Meanwhile, Vesper marked out the course himself. They carried him on a stretcher in a circle, and he set markers for the 12 checkpoints and drew lines in the snow that were supposed to converge at the castle. He stationed the novices in groups of 3 on all 4 sides and went over his part of the formula with each one separately, because even he couldn't hold the entire formula in his head now. Mark walked alongside the stretcher and jotted down everything Vesper said in a notebook. Vesper noticed and approved. He said that the calculations had to live in at least 2 minds and 3 notebooks. That the order had perished, not because of a mistake in the symbol, but because the task of verifying the symbol had been entrusted to a single person. Then he was silent for a long time and added quietly that it was he who had found the mistake that night, an hour before the ritual. And he didn't dare stop the master, because the master brooked no corrections, and Vesper was merely a scribe. 10 years of winter had sprung not from an incorrect symbol, but from his silence. He turned his pale eyes toward Mark and asked him to remember this better than any formula. The night before the camp was sealed off, no one slept. Armored guards and guild medics sat by the campfires, talking quietly about the pre-war days. Mark walked the entire perimeter. At the 6th station, Neva was feeding Ira from her bowl and told him that after the war, she intended to train as a healer under Oswin because the attic business was coming to an end and she had grown accustomed to working. At the 10th station, Seld was counting hot water bottles, and when he asked why she was here and not in the city, she replied that she had lived in the dead quarter for 10 years and wanted to see with her own eyes, see for herself how the quarter would cease to be dead. She looked up at him and asked if he had made his choice. Mark said he had and explained what it was. The old woman nodded without surprise and said that in that case, after everything was over, he should come to her for dinner because a person needs a table where someone is waiting for them. It was the longest moment of tenderness she had allowed herself in all the time they'd known each other. At dawn, the trouble they'd been expecting arrived. Astron's cocoon grew cloudy. The standing wave was thinning before their eyes, and through it they could see the Magister inside slowly turning his head. The other side was feeling its way toward its anchor. Vesper said they had until noon. The shutdown was scheduled for the morning. Mark walked through the door to Earth for the last time. Zeitz, Arno, and both porters were waiting for him by the garage. The farewell was brief and businesslike, as was everything with these people. Arno received a folder with papers and the keys and, as was his custom, tried to recalculate the share in Mark's favor, but was stopped. Zeitz received a letter with instructions in case the cold ring didn't melt on its own. Burn the spots with spirals and don't spare the fuel. Then Zeitz took Mark aside and spoke not a farewell but a business matter. He said that if an honest door ever opened again on the other side, the logistics would be ready and waiting on this side. He didn't believe in it, but he always made provisions. Mark walked toward the house across the frozen courtyard, saying his goodbyes in silence. The linden tree stood covered in frost, but still alive. No steam was rising from the 4th floor windows anymore, because the creatures had retreated into the mouth of the tunnel to wait for an order that would never come. Inside the apartment, he stood for a minute in the middle of the room. Then he stepped into the hallway and locked the icy door behind him with all the bolts on the winter side. By 9 in the morning, the ring was ready. 12 nodes burned with an even white light. 40 teams lay at 40 posts with knives and braziers. The novices clung to the stakes. Vesper was carried on a stretcher onto the platform at the center of the northern arc, from where he could see the entire ring. Dagmar took his place at the first knot, Torvald at the 7th, and Malden at the post with his son. According to the plan, Mark was assigned a spot at the most dangerous node, the 12th one, the one closest to the arch and to his own door, because his door was the weak point and was supposed to be extinguished from within the perimeter. Vesper raised his hand, and at that very moment the cocoon at the rear of the ring burst. The sound was like a shot fired from ice, Astron stepped out of the crumbling wave and headed straight for Pasty across the camp, and the light from the nodes faded before him in an arc. The inside had gotten there first. Vesper didn't lower his hand. He shouted from the platform to begin, because there would be no other morning, and the 12 nodes began to sing. The 12 nodes sang in unison. The sound came not from the speakers, but from the very air above Vesper's lines. The light from the nodes fell onto the snow in even trails, and the trails crept toward one another, closing the circle. The wound at the center of the ring trembled. A void emanated from it so profound that blood began to flow from the noses of the people all around the ring. And through it all, Astron was making his way toward the wound. He walked in a straight line from the burst cocoon, and that line led him across the eastern arc through the 9th node. The light of the 9th node went out when the Magister was 100 paces away. The 9th's armored soldiers lay in a tight formation, like a hedgehog behind the fiery moat, and Torvald led the reserves there. Mark heard everything at once over the radio. Vesper shouted from the platform, ordering the rookies to hold the eastern line at all costs because a broken circuit meant certain death for everyone. Torvald was wheezing about the fire. Dagmar was silent, and his silence on the airwaves was worse than the screams. The master stepped into the fiery moat as if into water, and the flames began to recede. And then Malden did what they hadn't agreed upon. The guild master left his pillar to the foreman, grabbed a barrel of mountain oil from the sled, and charged straight at Astron. He walked, pouring oil at his feet and over himself, and yelled at the Magister that for 10 years he'd fed his monsters with coal and his own son, and that the time had come for the final delivery. 5 steps from Astron, he unleashed a fire. A pillar of flame rose so high that it could be seen from the far arc. Living fire, the most alive of all, because the fury of a human being burned within it. The Magister stopped. For the first time in the entire war, he stopped of his own accord. The blind face beneath the crust turned toward the burning man, and the inner self, through its eyes, gazed at what it could not comprehend, at the heat that came toward it of its own accord, never ending, but growing ever hotter. Malden burned and held the Magister in place for 11 heartbeats. Mark counted them over the radio along with Vesper. On the 12th beat, the Guild Decurions rained down a volley of burning barrels from a catapult assembled from a cart onto both of them, and the greenhorns of the Eastern Trio, at Vesper's shout, dropped a wave onto the bonfire while standing wave onto the bonfire. The cocoon closed around Astron for the second time. Now, along with the fire inside, the wave trapped the flames and the Magister within the same space, and the flames had nowhere to go but into him. Vesper rasped into the radio that the furnace was ready and that no one dared open it. Malden was pulled out from under the edge of the wave by his own men, alive, terribly burned, but alive because the guild robe had been tailored over 40 years for people who worked in fire. Oswin was the first to take him in his arms. The circuit had completed its loop. Beams of light converged, and a ringing sound, like that of a giant bell beneath the ice, echoed around the entire ring. Vesper raised both hands, and at that signal, 40 teams struck their knives into 40 pillars. The window opened. After that, Mark's memory was fragmented. He remembered how, at his 12th node, the team pulled a gray-haired woman out of a pillar and how a medic covered her with hot water bottles right there on the sled. He remembered the scream from the southern arc where a pillar had cracked incorrectly, and the crew was doused by steam from the mouth of the river, and how the neighboring trio of misfits plugged the breach with a wave before it fully opened. He remembered Maldinovsky's foreman carrying his son out of the circle in his arms, and Malden's face watching this from the stretcher. 39 pillars came out clean. The 40th was hollow inside. The man inside had died years ago, and the lining held the shell together for the count. When the last body crossed the line, Vesper began the seal. He recited the formula from the platform in segments, and 4 trios of misfits each grabbed their segment and pulled the outline tight like a pouch. The wound in the center contracted. The absence of the layout, remnants crawled out of it. Dozens of walkers scrambled out of the wound as if from a burning house, got stuck in the light and the fire, and crumbled before reaching the lines. The inside was squeezing everything it had on this side out into the world because in a minute it would have no moves left. And at that moment, the 13th sound rang out, not a knot. Mark sensed it before he understood it, a thin, icy chime from the direction of the archway, from the direction of his door. The door was a weak spot, and the inside remembered its old move, the last one that hadn't been sealed. Vesper shouted from the platform that someone had to shut off the path with their hands from the inside because the lock's formula would only take the door if it was closed on both sides and cut off from life. No one understood what that meant except Mark. He was already running. He ran through the dead quarter along familiar alleys, and the ringing grew louder. At the archway, he saw what he'd feared. The hallway leading to his door glowed from within with a deathly white light, and fresh, barefoot footprints trailed along the frosted walls from the apartment to the exit. There were many of them. The other side was driving its final assault force through the earthly mouth to break the perimeter from the outside. The first walker was already emerging from the archway. Mark struck it in the face with a flare, and the creature recoiled into the hallway. He ran in after it through the crimson light and saw them. 5 gray figures in the hallway between the worlds, and behind them lay the icy door of his apartment, and beyond the door, his room, and within the room, the white glow of the opening portal. He did the only thing he had time for. He threw both remaining canisters of oil from the hiding place by the arch at the creature's feet, smashed the flare against the wall, and when the corridor burst into a sea of fire, he charged forward through the flames. Toward the door, his jacket was burning as he burst into the apartment, rolled across the floor, and threw his whole body against the icy door from the outside of the hallway into the room. The door gave way. The creatures were pounding against it from the other side, from within the fire. The fire in the room flared up and pulled the door toward it. Mark braced his back against the burning wood, his feet on the frozen linoleum of his own room, and screamed from the strain, hearing through the wall how the knots sang in the winter world. The door closed. The bolt clicked into place, and then Mark did the last thing Vesper's instructions called for: cut off the power to life. He pushed himself away from the door and stepped away from it, across his room toward the window, away from the passage. The summer dawn outside the window was gray with frost, but it was his earthly dawn, and for a single moment, Mark froze. He stood in the old apartment on the earthly side of the closed door, and the circuit was closing on the other side, without him. Mark stood in the middle of his earthly room, looking at the closed, icy door, and realized that he had done everything right, and that right, this time, meant staying somewhere other than where he had chosen. The door had to be closed from this side. Only he could close it, so that's how the numbers fell. Logistics doesn't ask how you feel. The smell of smoke wafted from under the door, and nothing else. The ringing had subsided. Mark pressed his palm against the wood, and the wood was simply cold. Not icy, just cold, like any door in an unheated room. He stood there for a long time. Then he forced himself to think about his neighbor. His jacket was smoldering, and his left forearm was swollen from a burn. He went down into the courtyard, and the courtyard greeted him with dripping water. Frost was melting off the linden tree, the swing, and the edge of the sandbox right before his eyes, and water was streaming from the roofs as if it were March. A ring of cold was fading throughout the neighborhood. Mark sat down on a wet bench called Zeitz and said that it had all just ended and that he was on this side now. Zeitz was silent on the line longer than ever before. Then he said he was on his way. The following months passed in a blur because life doesn't know any other way. The burn healed. The neighborhood reopened by fall, when the commission grew tired of searching for the source of the anomaly, which had disappeared on its own. Mark returned to the university's logistics department, and the professors marveled at the student who solved supply chain problems, as if he were transporting cargo under fire. He, Arno, and Zeitz re-registered the garage as a regular wholesale firm, and the firm dealt in equipment for northern expeditions because they never had anything else in their warehouses to begin with. Mark worked hard and steadily, and only Zeitz saw how every evening he would go up to the apartment they bought and sit there for an hour. The door remained closed. Mark didn't open it because he was equally afraid of two things: that there was a solid wall behind it, and that there wasn't a solid wall behind it but a dead-end corridor leading nowhere. He opened it in December when the first real snow fell on Earth. The latches were stiff. Behind the door was a corridor, entirely charred and dry. There was no frost in it. Mark walked to the end of it with his flashlight and came to a stop at an arch built of even masonry made of that familiar rough stone. The masonry was fresh, and in the center, one stone stood out in color. Mark looked closer, and his heart skipped a beat. A spiral was carved into the stone, but not an icy one with a double curl. It was the reverse one, unwound outward with a sun symbol at its center, and beneath it were 3 notches, just like the ones Zelda used to mark crates in the warehouse that had been accepted in perfect order. It was a message, the only one that could be slipped between worlds. They're alive. The shipment has been accepted. The passage is sealed according to the rules. Mark sat down on the floor of the charred corridor and laughed, then wiped his eyes and laughed again. Vesper Castle had sealed off the passage, but someone on the other side had identified a weak spot and sealed it, not like a wound, but like a door that the owners had locked. And owners lock what they intend to unlock one day. From that day on, Mark began to prepare. He reasoned like a logistics expert. Vesper was alive. Otherwise, there would have been no one to calculate the safe sealing of the passage. The order's calculations, with a corrected sign, exist in 2 minds and 3 notebooks, and one of those notebooks is his own, which he left in the headquarters tent. Vesper said that an honest channel between the worlds is possible if it's built from both sides, paid for with warmth rather than theft. So, one day, they'll start building from that side. That means a ready-made site must be waiting for them on this side. He bought an apartment 1 floor below and gradually bought out the entire riser over 3 years, as the company's finances allowed. He defended his thesis on logistics for isolated settlements and went on to pursue a master's degree in energy. The company grew, and Zeitz turned out to be right about the reserve they always set aside. 4 years passed. In December of the 4th year, Mark went up to his apartment one evening as usual, with a cup of tea, and froze in the doorway. Warm air was wafting across the floor from beneath the icy door. He opened the latches with hands that wouldn't obey him. The hallway glowed with a soft, yellow light at the end, and the masonry in the archway had been torn down. Standing in the archway was a young woman in a sturdy fur coat, a doctor's bag slung over her shoulder, and a white fox at her feet. Neva had grown 2 heads taller. She looked Mark up and down, and told him that he had aged and that his tea would go cold now. Then she buried her face in his once burnt jacket, the one he'd never thrown away, and held on to it for a long time. They walked down the hallway, and she talked nonstop. The mouth of the gorge had closed completely, and by the second spring, a real sun rose over Velkarn. The snow had melted away in 3 years. The city had rebuilt its port, the southern passes had opened, and the first caravans from the south had arrived in Velkar, bringing merchants who didn't believe the stories about light without fire. Dagmar ruled, and his daughter had grown up and told everyone that she had been saved by a merchant from the edge of the world. Malden, his face marked by burn scars, commands the guild, now called the Guild of Heat and Light, and his son leads the caravans. Oswin opened a school for healers, and Neva is the first of its graduates. Seld is alive, and every Sunday she sets an extra place at the table because she promised someone dinner. As for Vesper, he died last winter in his sleep after finishing the calculations for the double gates, leaving a note on the last page stating that the error had now been checked for heads and no one had remained silent. The gate had been under construction for 2 years based on his notebooks and Mark's notepad from the other side. Today it was opened for the first time, and the city council decreed that the first to pass through it should not be a caravan. The first to be called should be the one who paid for both worlds to move forward. They stepped out of the archway, and Mark stopped. Velharn lay beneath him in the winter twilight, but it was a living winter, an ordinary one. White and yellow lights burned in the windows, intermingled. Chimneys were smoking, children were running down the cleared street, and music was playing somewhere near the Way House. Above the rooftops in the clear sky were stars he had never seen in all his frosty months, because back then the sky had always been the lid of a cauldron. They were waiting for him by the fountain, Zelda in a new fur coat made from a single pelt, Malden with his son, Oswin, Torvald with his shield-bearers, without spears, and the icy woman with a jug above them, finally thawed to the consistency of stone. Mark was walking down the street toward them, the same street he had once run down in summer sneakers, fleeing the patrol, carrying a key in his pocket, an ordinary key to the new gate, forged in 2 copies by mutual agreement. One was kept here. He was to take the second one home and hang it in the garage next to the shipping documents, because starting tomorrow fair trade would begin between the worlds with customs, duties, scales, and a line of merchants. But today was just dinner. The table at Zelda's was set, and for the first time in 4 years, the extra place setting wasn't empty. Mark sat down in his seat, looked at the people around him, and realized the simple thing that made it all worth it. The key to the 2 worlds isn't a door in the wall of a rental apartment. The key to the 2 worlds is a table at which people are waiting for you on both sides of any wall. That night in Velharn, it was snowing. Ordinary gentle snow that melts in the spring, and it melted. 12 nodes began to sing in unison. The sound came not from speakers or wires, but from the very air above the Vesper lines, as if someone had drawn a bow across a string stretched between the nodes. The light from the nodes fell on the snow in even paths, and the paths crept toward one another, closing the circle. The snow along the paths did not melt, but glowed from within, like milk in a glass held up to a lamp. The wound at the center of the ring trembled. A void emanated from it, so intense that people all around the ring suddenly began blood from their noses, and Osvin's medics ran along the lines, handing out cotton swabs like ammunition. Mark stood by the 12th node and felt the sound enter his bones and remain there. And through it all, Astron was making his way toward the wound. He walked in a straight line from the burst cocoon, paying no heed to the path, stepping over burning ditches and abandoned sleds, and that straight line led him through the eastern arc, through the 9th node. Mark could trace his path by the way the lights were going out. Bonfire after bonfire, torch after torch. Darkness followed the Magister like a trail. The light of the 9th node went out when he was 100 paces away. It didn't flicker. It simply ceased to exist. The 9th's armored soldiers didn't run. They lay down in front of the Magister in a hedgehog formation behind the fiery moat, clashing their shields together, and Torvald led the reserves there, pulling units from the neighboring arcs. Mark heard everything at once over the radio, and the airwaves turned into a jumble from which he pieced out the essentials. Vesper from the platform was shouting at the rookies to hold the eastern line at all costs, because a broken circuit wasn't just a failure, it meant death for everyone inside. Torvald was wheezing about the oil and how the moat wouldn't be enough. Dagmar was silent, and his silence on the radio was worse than any scream because the governor was silent only when he was calculating losses in advance. The Magister stepped into the fiery moat as a man steps into shallow water. The flames around his feet began to curl into black flakes, and the flakes fell onto the snow like dead butterflies. 20 more steps, and he would have emerged behind the armored soldiers, where the misfits of the Eastern Trio were keeping their piece of the formula. And then Malden did something they hadn't agreed upon, and that wasn't in any of the plans. The guildmaster left his post at the foreman's side, even though his own son was standing there. He snatched a barrel of mountain oil from the sled, hoisted it onto his shoulder with the practiced movement of a coal burner, and charged straight at Astron across the empty space between the moat and the line. He walked, pouring oil over his feet, shoulders, and chest, and bellowed at the Magister's blind face. He screamed that for 10 years he'd fed his beasts with coal. that he'd paid the tithe like a coward while the fog devoured other neighborhoods, that he'd paid with his son and 9 men, and that now the time had come for the final cartload, and the guild, as was customary, always gave the last cartload for free. 5 paces from Astron, he struck a spark with a flint. A pillar of flame shot up so high that it was visible from the far arc, and the sentries on the edge assumed that a fuel depot had exploded. A living fire, the most alive of all those burning that night, because within it burned a man who had chosen to burn. The Magister stopped. For the first time in the entire war, through all the battles and retreats, he stopped of his own accord, without a wave or a wall. The blind face beneath the glass crust turned toward the burning man. Through her only eyes, the other side gazed upon what she could neither drink in nor understand. At the heat that neither fled nor hid, but came toward her of its own accord, never ending, growing hotter the closer it drew. For 10 years, every living thing in this world had either fled from her or frozen in her presence. This upset some inner balance within her. Malden burned and advanced, holding the master in place for 11 heartbeats. Mark counted these beats aloud into the radio along with Vesper, and the entire eastern flank counted along with them. On the 12th beat, the guild squad leaders hit both of them with a volley. The catapult, assembled overnight from a cart and wagon springs, hurled 4 burning barrels, and all 4 landed within a circle 3 paces wide. And the greenhorns of the Eastern trio at Vesper's shout unleashed a standing wave onto the bonfire. The cocoon closed around Astron for the second time, now along with the fire inside. The wave trapped the flames and the Magister within a single volume, and the flames had nowhere to go but into him. The transparent dome was flooded with a reddish glow from the inside, and within that glow stood a dark figure motionless. Vesper rasped into the radio that the furnace was ready and that whoever opened it before the appointed time would have to deal with him, personally with him, and he was angry now. A chuckle rippled through the chain. People laughed through the blood streaming from their noses, and that laughter spoke louder than any words. Their own men pulled Malden out from beneath the edge of the wave, alive, horribly burned, with blackened hands and no eyebrows, but alive and conscious because the guild robe had been tailored for 40 years for people working inside the fire, and Malden wore an old-style robe with double impregnation. Osvin was the first to take him in his arms, and the first thing the guild master said, through his caked-over lips, was about the pillar. He asked if they had pulled his son out. They replied that the window hadn't opened yet, and he nodded and allowed himself to lose consciousness. The circuit lasted until the short circuit. Trails of light converged at the castle, and a ringing sound, like that of a giant bell submerged beneath the ice, echoed throughout the ring. The ringing traveled through the soles of his feet, through his bones, through his teeth. The wound at the center contracted and, for the first time in 10 years, became smaller than it had been. Vesper raised both hands from the platform, and his silhouette against the backdrop of the singing nodes was like a conductor presiding over an impossible orchestra. At this signal, 40 teams struck their knives into 40 pillars. The window opened. After that, Mark remembered things in fragments, the way one remembers an accident. He remembered how, at his 12th node, a 6-person team pulled a gray-haired woman with open eyes out of a split pillar, and how a medic covered her with hot water bottles right there on the sled, and how the woman, on her 3rd breath, wept silently because her voice would not return to her until a week later. He remembered the scream from the southern arc, where the pole had cracked at an awkward angle, and the team was drenched by the spray from the gaping mouth of the ice, and how the neighboring trio of greenhorns plugged the breach with a wave of sheer stubbornness before the mouth had opened wider than a palm, and how the youngest of the greenhorns then sat down in the snow and was thrown up. He remembered Maldinovsky's foreman carrying a 20-year-old guy out of the circle in his arms, and the face of Maldinovsky himself, who came to on the stretcher at that very moment, as if on cue. He remembered how Neva, with Ira, darted back and forth along the lines like a liaison because the radios were going dead one after another, and her slender figure under the men's magnifying glass managed to be everywhere. 39 pillars came out clean. The 40th turned out to be empty inside. The person inside had died years ago, and the lining held the shell together for the sake of an even count, and no one ever found out why it needed to be an even count. When the last living body crossed the contour line, the Vesper began the lock. He recited the formula from the platform in bits and pieces, in a voice that was no longer that of an old man, but was simply an instrument, and 4 trios of misfits each picked up their own piece and pulled the contour tight like a pouch tied with 4 cords. The wound in the center was shrinking, the absence of a signal at the frequency that made dental fillings and old fractures ache. Remnants began to crawl out of the wound. Dozens of walkers poured out of it as if from a burning house, jostling and trampling one another, getting stuck in the light and the fire, and crumbling into piles of murky ice before reaching the lines. The other side was forcing everything it had on this side out into the world because in a minute it would have no moves left. This was not an attack. It was a one-way evacuation. And at that moment, through the singing of the knots, Mark heard the 13th sound, not a knot. A faint, icy chime from the direction of the city, from the direction of the dead quarter, from the direction of the arch and its door. He sensed that chime before he realized it because over the months that move had become a part of him. The door was a weak spot, and at the last minute, the other side remembered its old reconnaissance move, the only one that wasn't sealed. Vesper shouted from the platform, and for the first time, there was fear in his voice. He shouted that the lock's formula would only engage the door if it was closed on both sides and cut off from life, and that someone had to deactivate the passage by hand from the inside. No one but Mark understood what that actually meant. He was already running. He ripped the radio off his body, shoved it into the hands of the nearest plate-armored guard, shouted to tell Vesper that the courtyard supplier would take care of the 12th move, and ran through the dead quarter along familiar alleys, past boarded-up windows, past black marks, past the dye house basement where it all began. The ringing grew louder with every turn. At the archway, he saw what he'd feared the whole way. The hallway leading to his door glowed from within, with a deathly white light, and fresh barefoot footprints ran along the frosted walls from the apartment to the exit. Many footprints. The other side was driving its final assault force through the earthly gateway to break out of the encirclement from the rear and breach the perimeter from the outside where no one was defending it. The first runner was already emerging from the archway into the winter city. Mark struck it in the blind face with a flare from a running start, and the creature recoiled back into the corridor, hissing like a doused bonfire. He ran after it in the crimson, flickering light and saw them all. 5 slender gray figures stood in the corridor between worlds. Behind them, his icy door stood wide open. Beyond the door was his room. And in the room, cutting across the July night, the white radiance of the maw opened wide, and from that radiance came the same void as from the maw itself. The earth was a minute away from its own winter. Mark did the only thing for which he had enough time and strength. By the arch, in a hiding place from the previous week, lay 2 canisters of mountain oil set aside for a rainy day, and that rainy day had arrived. He threw both canisters at the creature's feet, lids first, smashed a second flare against the wall, and when the hallway burst into a continuous, humming fire from wall to wall, he leaped forward through the flames, heading forward, toward the door. His jacket was burning on him. His hair crackled. He burst into the apartment, rolled across the frozen linoleum, knocking the fire off himself, and threw his whole body against the icy door from the outside, pressing its show against the draft. The door moved heavily, like an airlock gate. The creatures were pounding against it from the other side, out of the fire, and the blows reverberated through his spine. The mouth in the room was open, pulling the door toward itself and warping it into a hump. Mark braced his back against the burning wood and his feet against the floor of his own room, screaming from the strain, and through the wall, through the worlds, he heard the knots singing. The door closed. The bolt slid into the bracket with that same icy crunch that had started it all, and then Mark did the last thing Vesper had instructed him to do. Cut off the power of life, the passage must remain without a single living being nearby, so that the formula would recognize him as dead and seal him off. He pushed off from the door and walked away from it across his room toward the window without looking back, because looking back meant not leaving. The white glow of the muzzle behind him flickered, it shrank. It went out with the sound of a snapped string. The summer dawn outside the window was gray with frost, but it was an earthly dawn. Mark stood in the middle of an old rented apartment on the earthly side of the closed door, his back scorched and his jacket smoldering. And on the other side, at that very moment, the circuit was closing. Without him. He had chosen that world and remained in this one because only the person standing on the threshold could close the door between them. That's the job. Someone has to stand on the threshold. Mark stood in the middle of his earthly room, staring at the closed, icy door, and realized he'd done everything right, and that right this time meant staying, not where he'd chosen. The door had to be closed from this side. Only he could close it. So that's how the numbers fell. Logistics doesn't ask how you feel. Logistics asks whether the cargo has arrived. The cargo has arrived. A whiff of smoke drifted from under the door, and nothing else. No frost, no ringing, no void. Mark pressed his palm against the charred wood, and the wood was simply cold. Not icy, just cold, like any door in an unheated room. He tried the bolt. The bolt held. He pressed his ear against the boards and heard a silence so deep that it couldn't possibly come from behind walls behind which something existed. He stood there for a long time, maybe an hour. Then he forced himself to think of his neighbor because his neighbor was the only thing he had left in this world. His jacket was smoldering. His left forearm was swollen from the burn and was starting to really hurt as the adrenaline wore off. He went down to the courtyard, holding onto the railing, and the courtyard greeted him with a drizzle. Frost was melting off the linden tree from the swings, from the edge of the sandbox, right before his eyes, and it was dripping from the roofs as if it were March. Dead patches of frost throughout the neighborhood were melting all at once, and steam rose from them in the morning light. The ring of cold was dissolving because, on the other side of all the thin spots, there was no longer anyone pulling at it. Mark sat down on the wet bench under the linden tree where he'd been sitting on that July day when Zeitz first knocked on his door and called Zeitz. He said it had all just ended, that the hole was closed, and that he was on this side. Zeitz was silent on the line longer than he'd ever been silent in all the time they'd known each other. Then he said he was on his way and that he was bringing a first aid kit and breakfast because, judging by his voice, he needed both. The following months passed in a blur because life doesn't know how to do otherwise. The burn healed, leaving a glossy mark on his forearm in the shape of an almost perfect spiral, and Mark spent a long time deciding whether to consider it a joke of fate or a bill presented inside out. The neighborhood was reopened by fall, when the commission grew tired of searching for the source of the anomaly, which had vanished on its own, leaving nothing behind but frozen pipes. A physicist from the university published an article about a unique geothermal incident and received a grant. Mark returned to the university, and the professors marveled at the student who solved supply problems for isolated facilities as if he himself were transporting cargo under fire at -50. He didn't argue with his grades or raise his hand in seminars, and only once during a discussion of a problem involving the supply of a polar station did he silently rewrite the associate professor's solution, reducing heat loss by a factor of 3. The associate professor stared for a long time, alternately at the board and at him. He, Arno, and Zeitz converted the garage into a wholesale company with a boring name, and the company in equipment for northern expeditions because there was literally nothing else in its warehouses. Business was booming. Zeitz turned out to be a natural-born director of development because 20 years of collecting debts give a person an understanding of the market that business school graduates could never hope to match. Arno handled the paperwork and, once a quarter, out of old habit, tried to recalculate the share in Mark's favor only to be stopped. On the surface, life had settled into a straight line, and only Zeitz saw how Mark, every evening after work, would go up to the apartment they'd bought on the 4th floor, sit there for exactly an hour, and come down with the look of someone who'd checked an mailbox. The door remained closed. Mark didn't open it for the rest of the summer or all of fall because he feared two things equally: that behind it would be a blank wall, and then everything would be final, and that behind it would be not a wall, but a dead, charred hallway leading nowhere. And then he would have to touch the finality with his own hands. He opened it in December when the first real snow fell on Earth and the city outside the window began to look a little like that other city. The latch was stiff. Behind the door was a corridor, intact, charred black, dry, and smelling of an old fire. It wasn't cold in there, and that alone answered half the questions. Mark walked through it with a flashlight, counting his steps, just like the first time. 20 steps. Then he came to an arch built of even, dense masonry made of that familiar rough gray stone. The masonry was fresh, the joints were neat, the work of craftsmen who take their craft seriously. And right in the center of the masonry, one stone stood out in color from the rest, like a patch deliberately placed in plain sight. Mark held the lantern closer, and his heart skipped a beat. A spiral was carved into the stone. But not the icy, double-coiled one he had come to hate, the reverse one. Spiral-shaped from the inside out, with a sun star in the center, carved deeply and meticulously. And beneath the spiral were 3 diagonal notches, exactly the same ones Zelda used to mark crates in the warehouse that had been accepted in perfect order with no shortages. It was a message. The only message that could be slipped between closed worlds. They're alive. The sun has returned. The shipment was accepted with no shortages. The passage was sealed according to the rules by the owners, and the owners only lock what they intend to unlock one day. Mark sat down on the floor of the charred corridor with his back to the warm masonry, laughing and wiping his eyes with his sleeve, then laughing again. And the sound of his laughter faded into the stone, beyond which an unknown number of steps and years away lay a living city. From that day on, he began to prepare. He reasoned like a logistics specialist because he didn't know how to do otherwise. First, Vesper is alive, or had been alive long enough, because only he could calculate the safe way to seal off the extinguished passage. Second, the Order's calculations with the corrected sign exist in at least 2 minds and 3 notebooks, and one of those notebooks is Mark's notepad left in the command tent near the ring. This means that on the other side, everything is in place to one day calculate an honest passage. Third, Vesper said by the hearth in the observatory that a 2-way gate is possible if it's built from both sides simultaneously, powered by heat according to the calculations, not by stealing it through a gnawed-through hole. So when they start building from that side, a ready-made receiving platform must be waiting for them on this side with energy, heat, and a person who knows the protocol. He bought the apartment 1 floor below, then another one. Over the course of 4 years, the firm bought out the entire riser, and the whole building considered the new owners to be eccentrics obsessed with energy self-sufficiency because solar panels had sprung up on the roof and battery cabinets, and a generator had been installed in the basement. Mark defended his thesis on logistics for isolated settlements and went on to pursue a master's degree in autonomous energy. And his thesis project on supplying a settlement without external grids was described by the reviewer as overly detailed, as if the author were planning to live there himself. Mark didn't argue. The firm grew, and Zeitz turned out to be right about the reserve they always set aside. 4 years passed. In December of the 4th year, Mark, as usual, one evening went up to his apartment with a cup of tea to check the empty mailbox between worlds and froze on the threshold of the room before he could reach the cup. A warm draft was coming from under the icy door and sweeping across the floor. Not the smell of smoke, not the frost. Warm air carrying the scent of a hearth fire, snow, and something else that made his throat tighten. He set the cup on the windowsill and opened the bolts with hands that refused to obey even the simplest commands. The hallway glowed at the far end with a soft, yellow, living light. The masonry in the archway had been dismantled, and the stones were stacked neatly against the wall, just as craftsmen who respect their materials would arrange them. And in the archway, against the backdrop of the yellow light, stood a young woman in a sturdy fur coat, a doctor's bag, slung over her shoulder, and a large white fox at her feet. Neva had grown 2 heads taller, both in stature and in the depth of her voice. She looked Mark over from head to toe, unhurriedly, as one examines a patient, and remarked that he had aged, that stubble didn't suit him, and that his tea on the windowsill would go cold. And then she crossed the threshold between worlds and buried her face in his chest, in the old, scorched jacket he'd never thrown away, and didn't let go for a long time, while Ira circled around them and lay down across the hallway, her muzzle facing the archway like a sentry who'd finally been relieved of duty. They walked down the hallway into the yellow light, and Neva talked non-stop, interrupting herself. The maw closed completely that very night, and by the second spring, a real sun rose over Velkarn. For the first 24 hours, the entire city simply stood in the streets with their heads tilted back. No one worked, and Dagmar issued an official decree declaring that day a holiday of idleness. The snow melted away within 3 years. The port was rebuilt. The southern passes opened up, and the city was the first caravans from the south in 10 years, and the southern merchants could not believe in light without fire, nor in white pills, nor in the city itself, which, to the best of their knowledge, had perished. Dagmar rules and is growing gray, and his daughter has grown up and tells everyone that she was saved by a merchant from beyond the edge of the world, though half the south considers this a local legend. Malden, in his burned-scarred, which he wears as guild insignia, commands the guild, now called the Guild of Heat and Light, while his son leads caravans across the mountain passes. Oswin has opened a school of healers at the bathhouse, and Neva is the first to graduate as a master. She already has 6 students of her own. Seld is alive and keeps the warehouse in its usual order, and every Sunday she sets an extra place at the table because she promised one person dinner, and she never goes back on her promises. As for Vesper, he died last winter in his sleep, in a warm room in the Citadel, having finished writing the last page of the calculations for the double gates and leaving a note beneath the final formula. He wrote that this time 4 minds had checked for errors and no one had remained silent. The gate had been under construction for 2 years, based on his notebooks and Mark's notepad, which Selda had saved from the command tent. This morning, it was opened for the first time, and the city council decided that the first to pass through would be neither a caravan nor an embassy. The first to be called would be the one who had paid for both worlds to move forward. They emerged from the archway, and Mark stopped at the top of the familiar street. Vilkarn lay beneath him in the early winter twilight. But this was a living winter, an ordinary, honest winter that comes in its own time and departs in its own time. White and yellow lights shone in a jumble from the windows. Chimneys were smoking. Children were racing down the cleared cobblestones on sleds. Somewhere near the way house, music was playing, and the smell of bread filled the air. And above the rooftops, in the clear, dark sky, stood stars that Mark had never seen here during all his frosty months. Because back then, the sky had always been the lid of a cauldron, but now the lid had been lifted. They were waiting for him by the thawed fountain. Selda, in a new fur coat sewn from a single pelt. Malden with his son on his right. Oswin in a robe, over which hung a simple pulse oximeter on a cord as a symbol of the new school. Torvald in chainmail without spears, and the stone woman with a jug above them, finally freed from 10 years of ice down to the very last fold of her dress. Mark was walking down the street toward them, the same street where he had once run in summer sneakers from the first patrol of his life, carrying a key in his inner pocket, an ordinary forged key to the new gates, made in 2 copies by mutual agreement. One would remain here in the Citadel. He was to take the second one home and hang it in the garage next to the waybills, because starting tomorrow morning, fair trade would open between the worlds with scales, duties, customs, and a line of merchants from both worlds, and fair trade loves boring words. But all that was tomorrow. Today was just dinner. Seldy's table was set for everyone, and for the first time in 4 years, an extra place setting wasn't left empty, and Era received her own portion without being reminded. Mark sat down in his seat, looked at the people around the table, at the steam rising from the bowls, at the fire in the hearth, which was simply a fire in the hearth, and realized a simple truth that made the entire journey worthwhile, from the knock of his fist on the door of the rented apartment to this very chair. The key to the two worlds is not a door in the wall, nor is it a passage between winter and summer. The key to the two worlds is the table at which you are awaited on both sides of any wall. That night, snow was falling over Velkar, ordinary, gentle snow that lies until spring and melts when the time comes. In the spring it melted,